Hey there. If you're new, welcome to the channel. If you're a regular, welcome back. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Let me know in the comments. Now, sit back, relax, and let the stories begin. The story unfolds during the summer of 2004. For the past few years, I'd been regularly hiking through the trails of a local state park. The journey to the park was always easy, and this time was no different. I parked near the ranger station and made sure to inform him of my intentions. After a final check of my gear, I started my usual 2-mile hike to my favorite campsite. What I didn't know at the time was that someone else's life had just taken a tragic turn, and mine was about to follow. My passion for the outdoors began shortly after the September 11th attacks. While I wasn't at any of the locations directly affected, I lost someone very close to me. She and I had been college sweethearts, but we drifted apart over time. Thanks to the internet, we reconnected. We had been planning to meet up for Thanksgiving and were even talking about rekindling our relationship. I was devastated when I heard the news of her death and quickly began contemplating ending my own life. I went so far as packing a bag and heading out to the spot where I had planned to do it. But when I got there, something unexpected happened. The beauty of the surroundings took me by surprise. Even though I was still deeply grieving, the tranquility of the place made me reconsider my decision. The healing process was slow, and whenever the grief became unbearable, I sought refuge in nature, which always brought me some peace. Fast forward to the summer of 2004, and by this point, these hikes had become a regular part of my life. The first evening passed without incident. The following day, I weighed my options and decided to venture down into the canyons. These trips often led me to discover a few stone points for my growing collection. After having some oatmeal, I set off on the trail. About halfway down the cliffside, a flash of light caught my attention. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Then another bright flash blinded me. I quickly regained my sight and noticed a pair of arms flailing about 50 feet further down the cliff. I hurried down the trail for a better view and spotted a rocky outcrop off to the side, which I quickly leapt onto. The rock beneath me immediately started shifting. As I fell, it felt as though time had slowed to a crawl. I braced myself for a painful impact, but when I landed, it wasn't as bad as I had anticipated. Lying there on my back, I realized I had only fallen about 20 feet. I stayed still for a couple of moments, then remembered why I had come here. When I tried to get up, I realized my left foot was trapped between two large rocks. I pushed against the top rock while pulling my leg, and with a little effort, I managed to free myself. Once back on my feet, I looked around for the person I had seen earlier. To my right, I spotted a woman lying almost motionless. I carefully stepped down the cliffside until I reached her, and she looked dead initially, but her lips began moving. I kneeled down to her and began speaking. Calmly, I asked her name. Her eyes slowly opened and a smile grew in her face. I thought you were dead when I saw that rock collapsed. A scratchy yet kind voice addressed me. I don't mean to be rude, mister, but you wouldn't happen to have any water, would you? I hastily dug through my pack for my Nalgene. The bottle was a little dented but showed no leaks. Slowly and carefully, I placed the opening to her lips and poured a small amount in. I knew she may vomit if I gave her too much at once. For the next few minutes, we spoke about how she ended up there. I would occasionally pour a little more water into her mouth. She was obviously in a great deal of pain, and I knew the longer I wasted talking, the longer she was from medical help. I told her of my plan and covered her with a fleece from my pack. Climbing back up the loose rocky hill was harder than coming down. I was beginning to feel a lot of pain myself, especially in my back. At first, I attempted a hobbling type of run, but my knees wouldn't allow it. Instead, I settled on a fast walk. The journey was long and painful, but I reached the ranger's post at just after 12:45 p.m. To his credit, he had a rescue team assembled within minutes. I had to settle for an ambulance ride and an overnight stay in the hospital. I think it was almost 6 p.m. when I saw the ER staff rolling her in, and the wait wasn't over, unfortunately. She'd been taken into emergency surgery soon after arriving, and several hours would pass until I'd heard anything. But when the news arrived, it was good. In spite of having a punctured lung, a concussion, a broken arm, and assorted other injuries, she would go on to make a full recovery. My path to healing is a story for another time, but Shannon was her name, did reunite with her loving family and go on to start one of her own. Last I heard, she was living in Colorado with her husband and 3 sons. And I hope everyone will join me when wishing her a long and happy life. I'm just happy I could be there to help her through all that she suffered. This happened just last winter in early February. I was driving to my next DoorDash order. I was a little tired since I'd been on the road for the past 4 hours, and it was almost midnight. After this delivery, I was definitely calling it a night and heading home, as I was concerned about getting drowsy while driving, especially with all the ice and snow. I was cruising down a pretty quiet road. It's a side road that connects 2 main towns in our area, but there's a 5-mile stretch with absolutely nothing. No buildings, no houses, nothing to stop for. As I was driving through the stretch, I'm not sure what happened, but I suddenly felt this overwhelming wave of exhaustion, and for just a few seconds, I lost focus on the road. That brief moment was all it took. I hit a patch of ice and began sliding toward the side of the road. Although I snapped back to alertness right away, it was too late. I tried to steer back onto the road, but my car just slid straight off into a small ditch between the road and the woods. The crash wasn't bad at all because the snow softened the impact, but it still left me shaken, and I immediately realized I wasn't going to be able to get out of this. My car was stuck on the incline of the ditch, buried in thick snow. I didn't bother getting out to check the damage, though I did try to move the car to get some traction. All that did was make things worse. While I was in the middle of trying to figure things out, I noticed headlights shining down the road. At first, I thought it was just a car passing by, but after a few seconds, I realized they weren't moving. Someone must have just parked down the road with their headlights on, which felt kind of unsettling given the desolate stretch of road. The car wasn't close enough to have stopped and offered help, but it wasn't far enough to not notice my headlights either. I pulled out my phone and called my dad, knowing he'd still be awake and hoping he could help. I'd never been in a situation like this before, so I wasn't sure what to do. He said he would call roadside assistance and then drive down to wait with me. I thanked him and felt some relief knowing he'd be on his way soon. I looked back at the road to spot the headlights again, but they were gone. It was too dark to see much that far without the lights, so I wasn't sure if the car had driven off or if it had just turned off its lights. The more I thought about it, the creepier it started to feel. I kept my eyes fixed down the road, not looking away for more than a few seconds as paranoia started creeping in. The silence made it even worse. The only sound I could hear was the wind outside my car, and everything else was completely still. After a few minutes of waiting, I saw a figure walking toward my car. He was coming from the direction where the headlights had been. I watched him slowly make his way through the snow, getting to about 15 feet from the front of my car. Then he stopped. He just stood there in the snow, facing me, not moving. I couldn't make out much of him, as he had a hoodie covering his face. But the way he just stood there, staring back at me, made my headlights feel almost suffocating. After a moment, I honked my horn softly a few times, just to let him know I was in the car and had noticed him. He still didn't move or acknowledge me. But just as I was about to pull out my phone to call my dad again, the man turned around and walked away, disappearing down the road. I quickly called my dad to let him know about the strange person out there, and he said he was just a minute away. I stayed on the phone with him, and only 30 seconds later, I saw headlights turn on down the road and start moving toward my car. Once they got right across from me, they parked and turned off their lights. I couldn't see over the ditch, but I heard a door open as I yelled through the phone, telling my dad what was going on. Then my dad's car suddenly appeared right in front of me and screeched to a stop. I heard him yell at someone as they got back in their car and sped off. They didn't come back, but my dad said the guy was holding something in his hands that looked like he was about to break into my car with. After that, everything went okay, and my car didn't even have much damage to it. I'm still not sure what was about to happen that night, but I know I'm lucky I didn't have to find out. The scratching at the window was so faint at first, I thought it was just the wind. But as the sound grew more insistent, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I was miles from civilization, alone in a cabin I'd rented for a peaceful getaway. Yet something was out there in the darkness trying to get in. And as I would soon learn, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would push me to the very edge of sanity. I booked the cabin on a whim, desperate for an escape from the chaos of city life and the constant pressure of my high-stress job. The listing promised seclusion and tranquility, nestled deep in the woods with no neighbors for miles. It sounded perfect. The drive up had been beautiful, winding through dense forests and along crystal-clear streams. As I pulled up to the cabin, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The place was charming, if a bit rustic. A small two-story log structure with a wide porch and large windows overlooking the surrounding wilderness. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. I hiked the nearby trails, breathed in the crisp mountain air, and spent the evening curled up by the fireplace with a good book. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a distant bird or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I'd gone to bed early, lulled by the peace and quiet, but sometime in the dead of night, I jolted awake, my heart pounding. For a moment, I couldn't pinpoint what had disturbed me. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I lay there, barely breathing, straining my ears. The footsteps completed a circuit around the house, then paused. A long moment of silence followed, broken suddenly by a sharp tap on my bedroom window. I nearly leapt out of my skin. The rational part of my brain tried to come up with explanations. It was probably just a branch blown by the wind, or maybe some nocturnal animal. But as I listened, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Too rhythmic, too intentional to be anything but a person. "Hello," I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Is someone there?" No response. Just more tapping, growing more insistent. I reached for my phone, ready to call for help, only to remember with a sinking feeling that there was no cell service out here. The cabin had a landline for emergencies, but it was downstairs in the living room. Gathering my courage, I slipped out of bed and crept toward the window. With trembling hands, I pulled back the curtain just a crack. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then a movement caught my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the dim moonlight. As I watched, it raised a hand and waved slowly as if it knew I was looking. I let the curtain fall back into place, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. I was alone out here, miles from the nearest town. How could someone else be here? The tapping started again, this time at the living room window downstairs. I had to get to that phone. Taking a deep breath, I crept out of the bedroom and down the stairs, wincing at every creak of the old wooden floorboards. The living room was dark, lit only by slivers of moonlight peeking through the curtains. I made it to the phone and picked up the receiver, nearly sobbing with relief when I heard a dial tone. My fingers shook as I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone outside my cabin, I whispered, afraid the intruder might hear me. They're trying to get in. I need help. Okay, stay calm. What's your location? I froze. In my panic, I'd forgotten the exact address of the rental cabin. I don't know the exact address. It's a rental out in the woods, maybe 20 miles north of Pine Grove. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sir, we're going to need more information than that to send help. Are you in immediate danger? Before I could answer, a loud thud came from the front door, like someone had thrown their whole body against it. I dropped the phone, terror coursing through me. The thudding continued, the old wooden door groaning under the assault. I looked around wildly for a weapon, anything to defend myself. My eyes landed on the fireplace poker. Just as I grabbed it, the door burst open with a sickening crack. And there, silhouetted in the doorway, was the figure I'd seen in the woods. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long and thin to be human. As it ducked to enter the cabin, I caught a glimpse of its face in the moonlight. My blood ran cold. Where there should have been eyes, there were only dark, empty sockets. I scrambled backwards, the poker held out in front of me like a sword. "Stay back," I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. The creature tilted its head, regarding me with those empty eye sockets. Then, to my horror, it spoke. Its voice was like dry leaves rustling barely above a whisper. "We've been waiting for you," it said, "for so long." I managed to choke out. As if in answer, more figures appeared in the doorway behind the first 3, 4, 5 of them, all with the same elongated limbs and eyeless faces. They began to advance into the room, moving with an unnatural grace. I swung the poker wildly, but it passed right through the nearest creature as if it were made of smoke. In that moment, I realized that whatever these things were, they weren't physical beings. They were something else, something not of this world. I ran up the stairs into the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I pushed the heavy oak dresser in front of it, knowing even as I did so that it was futile. These things didn't need doors. Sure enough, they began to seep into the room, passing through the walls as if they were no more substantial than mist. They surrounded me, their eyeless gazes boring into me. "What do you want?" I cried, pressing myself against the wall. "To show you," the first one said. "To open your eyes." It reached out a long, spindly hand towards my face. I tried to pull away, but I was frozen in place, unable to move. As its cold fingers touched my forehead, the world around me began to shift and warp. The walls of the cabin melted away, replaced by swirling cosmic vistas. I saw impossible geometries, heard sounds that no human ear was meant to hear. In that moment, I understood. These beings weren't evil, weren't here to harm me. They were messengers, guardians of some greater truth that lay just beyond the veil of our reality. They showed me wonders and horrors beyond imagination. The birth and death of universes, the grand cosmic dance of creation and destruction. I saw my own life, my own death played out across the tapestry of time. When I came back to myself, I was lying on the floor of the bedroom. Sunlight was streaming through the windows, and birds were chirping outside. The creatures were gone, leaving no trace of their presence. I staggered to my feet, my mind spinning from the madness I had just endured. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination brought on by stress and isolation? But as I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror, I knew it had been real. My hair had turned stark white, and in my eyes, I could see the echoes of the cosmic vastness I had witnessed. I left the cabin that day, driving back to the city in a daze. I tried to tell others what had happened, but the words always fell short. How could I describe the indescribable? In the years since, I've never been able to shake the memory of that night. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear those footsteps again, circling. And part of me, God help me, longs to see those eyeless faces once more, to peer again beyond the veil of our limited reality. Because once you've glimpsed the true nature of the universe, how can you ever be content with the mundane again? I know they're still out there, waiting. And someday, I think I might just go back to that cabin in the woods to see what other truths they have to show me. I remember it being unusual for there to be fog during that time of year along the beaches of LA. I won't go into the exact details of where or when to avoid sounding like a madman, but it was bonfire night, and all the cool folks in the neighborhood were invited out to the beach. And naturally, we all went. Friends and strangers alike gathered on the beach to smoke, drink, and watch the younger, more adventurous kids spin fire and poi, doing all those things they're so into. The reason I was there was because my friend Ben insisted I join him for this cool bonfire party on the beach. Ben's always been a great guy. I've known him for 25 years, and he's a Broadway performer, mostly cast as a singer. I was proud of him, and I was also the best man at his wedding. I know this guy, but things change. There was this girl there. She had long blonde hair, curves, and these magnetic blue eyes. A dream come true for me. I sat away from the bonfire on a log, thinking about other things, but also thinking about her. This beautiful girl came up to me, introduced herself, and asked, "What are you doing sitting here all alone? You want to rip this?" I would have been an idiot not to partake. So naturally, I did. I got stoned. She was hot. Don't judge me. As I mentioned, it felt strange that it was so foggy, misty even that night. It was almost like a cloud had decided to settle right on the beach, which was unusual. Then, out of nowhere, Ben approached me and the girl I was talking to and asked, "Want to take a walk?" It struck me as odd because I figured it was obvious that I was perfectly content right where I was, chatting with this stunning girl. But for some reason, both she and I said, yes, and so we walked, deeper into the fog and mist, without giving much thought to our instincts or questions. Looking back now, it felt like I was being drawn toward something, called to do something I didn't understand. It was such a weird feeling. Ben, the girl, and I walked past the bonfire, away from the warm light, into the strange fog and mystery. One of the last things I remember from that night was seeing a big, bright light, surrounded by the mist. Naturally, I thought, why not? So I walked toward the light, obscured by the smoke, fog, and whatever else was there. The next thing I remember is waking up to my alarm clock ringing madly at 3 in the afternoon, a time I'd never set it for. I was late for work. On my thigh was a painful, BB-sized bump that I couldn't stop obsessing over. All I wanted to do was scratch at it. When I got to work, something felt off from the moment I walked in. The owner of the place called me into his office and said, "Rick, I need to talk to you." Walking into the office of this piece of crap I worked with for so long, I was ever so curious what he had to say this time. "Why didn't you come into work yesterday?" "I'm sorry I was late. I usually make it by my 2 o'clock shift," and then the interruption happened in which he said, "Yeah, you were supposed to be at work at 2 yesterday, and now here you are, a day late and $1 short." So I left. I left because I was confused. I sort of remembered being with Ben the night prior, so I figured he'd be able to fill in the details. He's always been an awesome friend like that. So, yeah, I drove to Huntington Beach to visit him and his wife at his apartment complex. Now, I have always known that Cleo was a shy woman, but I had earned my stripes with her and I was best man at her wedding. It was so strange to see her with the chains and the bolts attached to the door as she opened it. "Yeah?" She asked me. "Hey, Cleo," I said. "I was hoping to speak with Ben." "He can't speak," is what she replied with. Onward and onward into the light we walked, into the mist, into the fog. But the strange beacon of light that dwelled inside of it, that is the one that kept us all going. Into the white light I walked. "What?" I asked her. "He doesn't want to speak to me?" "No," she said. "It's not that he doesn't want to speak with you. He just cannot speak." This was an immediate thing and/or occurrence that perturbed me. I mean, like, what? Decidingly, I barged in through the door to check it upon my best friend, in which I found him lying up on the floor struggling to scream with the most clogged, stopped, guttural sound protruding from his throat. It's in my voice. It's in my throat. He wriggled and writhed on the floor and Cleo, and I witnessed him convulse upon the floor before he just fell asleep again. This was a man who performed on Broadway, and he had the voice of an angel. For someone to scream at me in a night terror daydream walk. Yeah. Scary when one says, "It's in my voice. It's in my throat." I figured my best friend had a thing going on, and alone is where I left him. When I returned home, however, is where I began with the picking and scratching and the BB-sized bump. I had been picking at it more and more, so then it just popped out of my leg just like a BB-sized bullet would when not being pursued. It rolled underneath the refrigerator. So yeah, in a bit of bewilderment, there I sat, just witnessing. I sat in the kitchen with the tension and the silence, and being a part of a foreign alien BB rolled outside of my thigh and under the refrigerator, and yes, I asked myself what just popped out of my body. Ben and I never got to speak much after that. I never got to explain how there was a hole taken out of my thigh. I never got to ask him how it could ever be possible that he and I lost an entire day. Why did he scream if it was in his throat, in his voice? Oftentimes I am asked by others if I speak to Ben these days. I do, but not much anymore. And not in the same way, unfortunately. When we do speak to each other, he absolutely refuses to discuss what happened that evening. It's frustrating for me because I have so many questions. Oftentimes, I am asked to reveal the hole punch taken out of my thigh and it looks insane. And I'm tired of the crosstalk. I can't explain it. Most folks tell me I was just high or something within that caliber. But when you've done every drug underneath the sun, it's rather easy to tell them when you might have experienced something that did not happen within this world, within this universe. And I ask myself almost every day, what exactly happened? Where did I go? What happened to my best friend? Why did that blonde beauty disappear? And how exactly did I lose an entire day out of my life? And why is there a hole in my thigh? I like to think I'd certainly remember that sort of pain being inflicted upon me. Seriously, dude, why is there a hole in my thigh? The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour, and I squinted through the glass, trying to make out anything in the deserted stretch of highway. That's when I saw her, a lone figure stumbling along the shoulder, drenched, her clothes clinging to her like a second skin. I slowed the car, my gut twisting with hesitation. Every instinct screamed at me to drive on, but I couldn't bring myself to leave her out here in the storm. I pulled over, my hazard lights flickering weakly in the dark. As I rolled down the window, she approached, her face hidden behind a curtain of wet hair. "Are you okay?" I called out, raising my voice to cut through the relentless pounding of the rain. "Do you need a ride?" She looked up then, and a cold shiver ran down my spine, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Her eyes were wide, desperate, and there was a streak of something dark across her cheek that I hoped was just mud. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Please help me." Against my better judgment, I unlocked the doors. She climbed in, bringing with her the smell of rain, and something else, something metallic that made my nose wrinkle. "Thank you," she breathed, pushing her soaked hair back from her face. In the dim interior light, I could see she was young, probably in her early 20s. She was pretty, despite looking like she'd been through a hell of a night. "I didn't think anyone would stop," she said softly. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral as I eased the car back onto the highway. She hesitated for a moment, just a beat too long. "The next town, Millbrook. Do you know it?" I asked, glancing at her. I nodded, though I hadn't thought about the place in years. It was about 30 miles down the road, a small, forgettable town I'd passed through 100 times during my sales routes. "I'm John," I said, figuring I should at least introduce myself to the stranger I just let into my car. "Alice," she replied. Something in her voice made me wonder if that was really her name. We drove in silence for a while, the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the constant drumming of rain on the roof the only sounds. I kept sneaking glances at Alice, trying to figure her out. Despite being soaked and covered in mud, her clothes looked expensive. And there was something about the way she sat, tense and alert, that made me uneasy. "So," I said, unable to stand the silence any longer, "what brings you out here on a night like this?" Alice flinched as if my question had physically struck her. I had car trouble," she said, not looking at me. "Broke down a few miles back," she added. It was a plausible enough story, but something about it didn't sit right. I opened my mouth to ask another question, but she quickly cut me off. "Look, I really appreciate the ride, but I'd rather not talk, if that's okay. It's been a long night." I nodded, focusing back on the road, but my mind was racing. Who was this woman? What was she running from? Because it was clear now that she was running from something. We'd been driving for about 15 minutes when I saw the flashing lights in my rear view mirror. A police car coming up fast behind us. "Damn," I muttered. "Looks like I might have been speeding." "Don't worry, I'll just explain the situation then." But Alice wasn't listening. She had gone rigid in her seat, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at the approaching police car. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no, please, you can't let them catch me." My blood ran cold. What are you talking about, Alice, and what's going on? She turned to me then, her eyes pleading. I'll explain everything. Promise. But please, please don't stop. If they catch me, they'll kill me. I hesitated, my foot hovering over the brake pedal. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to stop, to let the police handle whatever this was. But something in Alice's eyes, the raw fear I saw there, made me do the unthinkable. I pressed down on the accelerator. The car lurched forward, engine roaring as we sped down the rain-slicked highway. The police siren wailed to life behind us, and I saw more flashing lights joining the pursuit. Jesus Christ, I swore, knuckles white on the steering wheel. What the hell have you gotten me into? Alice was fumbling with something in her pocket. She pulled out a small cloth-wrapped bundle and thrust it at me. Take it, she said urgently. Hide it. They can't find this. I took the bundle without thinking, shoving it into my jacket pocket. What is it, drugs? She shook her head. It's evidence. Proof of what they've been doing. The corruption, the murders, it's all in there. My mind reeled. Corruption. Murders. What had I stumbled into? The car fishtailed as we took a curve too fast, and I fought to keep control. The police were gaining on us. Their sirens a constant, nerve-shredding wail. There's a turnoff up ahead, Alice said, leaning forward to peer through the rain-streaked windshield, an old logging road. If we can make it, we might lose them. I saw it, a barely visible break in the trees. At the speed we were going, trying to make that turn would be suicide. But the alternative was to be caught by whoever was chasing us. And something told me that would be even worse. I made a split-second decision, wrenching the wheel to the right. The car skidded, tires screaming in protest. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought we were going to flip. But then we were on the logging road, bouncing and jolting down the unpaved track. The dense forest closed in around us, branches scraping against the sides of the car. I killed the headlights, plunging us into near total darkness. It was madness to drive like this, but I could still hear the sirens behind us, growing fainter but not gone. We drove for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The old road twisted and turned, taking us deeper into the woods. Finally, when I could no longer hear any sign of pursuit, I brought the car to a stop in a small clearing. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the patter of rain on the roof. Then Alice turned to me, her face pale in the dim light. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I never meant to drag anyone else into this. Start talking, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Who are you really? And what the hell is going on? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. She took a deep breath, seeming to collect herself before speaking. My name isn't Alice, she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. It's Detective Sarah Reeves. I've been working undercover for the past year, investigating a ring of corrupt cops in Millbrook. The story she told me over the next half hour was straight out of a crime thriller. A small-town police force running drugs, taking bribes, even committing murder to cover their tracks. Sarah had been sent in to gather evidence, but her cover had been blown earlier that night. They came for me at my apartment, she said, her eyes haunted. I barely got out alive. I managed to grab the evidence, she continued, but I lost my phone, my badge, everything. She looked at me then, her expression desperate. When I saw you on the road, I thought you might be one of them. I sat back, trying to process it all. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as an elaborate lie, to think I hadn't just aided a fugitive and evaded the police. But the fear in her eyes, the raw conviction in her voice, it was too real to be fake. So what now? I asked, running a hand through my hair, my mind racing. We can't stay out here forever. Sarah nodded grimly. I have a contact in the state police. If we can get to him, show him the evidence, he can help us. But it's risky, she added. They'll be watching the roads, and I don't know who else might be compromised. I thought about the bundle of evidence in my pocket, about the life I'd left behind the moment I decided to help the stranger. There was no turning back now. I was in this for better or worse. Okay, I said, starting the car again. Let's do it. As we pulled out of the clearing, heading back toward the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had changed forever. What started as a routine sales trip had now landed me smack in the middle of a conspiracy, deeper and darker than I could have ever imagined. But as I glanced at Sarah, her face set with determination, I knew I'd made the right choice. Whatever came next, whatever dangers awaited us, we'd face them together. The night was far from over, and our story was just beginning. When I was 15, I was going through some pretty tough stuff. My parents had recently divorced, I was dealing with depression, and I had insomnia, which made everything feel even worse. One late night, I was texting my best friend, Lynn, who I don't talk to much anymore, partly because of what happened. I don't remember exactly what we were talking about, but I clearly remember looking over at the corner of my room and seeing a tall shadow there, about 6 or 7 feet tall. I froze. My mind tried to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was just a shadow from a tree outside, right? I slowly turned my head to look out the window, but there was no way a tree could be casting a shadow like that. The wind was too strong, and the tree didn't even line up with where the shadow was. I looked back at the shadow, and it was still there, perfectly still. Feeling uneasy, I texted Lynn, "There's something in my room, and I'm really scared." Right after I sent the message, the shadow just dissipated, fading away, and with it, the dread I had been feeling lifted. But then, Lynn texted me back, "There's something here too, a really tall shadow in the corner of my room, and I'm freaking out." Her room had no window, so there was no way she could mistake it for a tree shadow. After reading her text, the sense of dread returned. The shadow was back, now standing at the foot of my bed. It was too dark to get a photo, and honestly, I wasn't even thinking about taking a picture. I was terrified. My breathing became labored, and I felt a panic attack creeping in. Suddenly, my phone battery, which had been at 80%, dropped to 0 and died. The panic attack hit me full force, and I frantically reached for my charger, plugging it in while keeping my eyes on the shadow. But when I glanced away for just a second, it was gone. My phone powered back up immediately, and I texted Lynn, "I think it killed my phone battery. What the hell? I'm scared." A few minutes later, Lynn replied, "It was standing next to my bed, all black, and I'm scared. Killed my phone battery too, but it's fine now. It's gone again." That's when it hit me. There seemed to be a pattern. The shadow appeared right after we texted, almost like it was responding to the messages. I started texting everyone I could think of, just random, harmless things like, "How are you?" or "Been a while. You okay?" Hoping to stretch things out, maybe confuse it. Big mistake. As soon as I started texting, my bed began shaking violently. The headboard slammed against the wall, and my blankets were ripped off the bed. I saw the shadow at the foot of the bed again, and I just reacted. I jumped off the bed and headed for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I leaped, I felt a cold hand grab my ankle, almost pulling me back toward the bed. I yanked open the door and switched on the light, but the light flickered, blinding me for a moment, before the bulb shattered everywhere. I screamed, ran across the hall, and burst into my mom's room, sobbing uncontrollably. And she laughed. She laughed at me. I was terrified, convinced something evil was in my room, and she laughed. I told her I wasn't going back in there until I got a new light bulb. She promised she would buy one the next day, handed me a flashlight, and told me to sleep in the living room. I grabbed my charger and made a run for the living room, turning on every light I could. After a few days, I tried sleeping in my room again, but I had to get a new bulb first. Even then, I slept with a flashlight by my bed for a long time after that. To this day, my mom refuses to talk about it. No one else ever experienced it, and no one believes me. The worst part is, I can't walk to my bed in the dark without feeling that cold hand on my ankle. I'm from Latvia and lived in a very small town for 15 years before my mom moved us to the UK. The town was so tiny that we only had 3 stores, each just a few meters apart from each other. Rumors spread fast there, like wildfire, and everyone knew everyone's business. Max had this reputation of being a kid with a few mental issues. His mother was a hardcore alcoholic, and his father wasn't in the picture, just a series of stepdads, each one worse than the last. I kind of felt sorry for him, though, because my mom raised me and my twin brother on her own. My dad was either passed out drunk in some rundown apartment or, when sober, whining about how he thought his heart would stop soon and how he needed medication. I can't help but roll my eyes when I think about it. Since the town was so small, I went to primary school with all the same kids, and Max's antisocial behavior was already apparent. He'd throw tantrums, steal from other kids, push people around, pretty typical for him. He even threw big wooden dice at another boy once, which gave the kid a crack right between his eyebrows. He still has a scar there. I've even seen it on Instagram. I don't remember what set him off that day, though. Around the age of 12, we kind of became friends. I had the same label of the weird kid, because, up until I was 15, I had this strange habit of spinning pens and pencils on the floor while I daydreamed about my imaginary world for hours. My parents even thought I might have autism because of it. It turned out it was just a coping mechanism since I was the black sheep of my family and had trouble connecting with friends. That's when I really started clinging to Max. He secured his position as my good friend through what I can only describe as love bombing. While this term is often used in relationships, it's the closest thing I can find to describe what he did. Basically, it's like the honeymoon phase before the true colors come out. Then manipulation began at first. Something small like snatch some cigarettes from your granddad. Then it escalated to, if I would get a new toy or some sort of cool gift from my parents, he would ask to play with it, but then I wouldn't see it for days because he would pretend like he accidentally put it in his pocket and forgot to give it back. If I called him out, he would bring up the fact that his family is poor, telling me stuff about how privileged I am and that people like me should starve for a week to know the true struggle. But the thing I hated the most was the "it's just a joke." Whatever he would do, something that made me terrified, like throwing lit matches at me while saying, "I'll burn you alive." It was some kind of hilarious joke, or pulling me down when we had PE in a pool. And if you ever were fortunate enough to experience drowning, you know what a scary experience it is. Thank God the coach banned him from practice. He also was the first person who I came out to. In Latvia, homophobia is pretty much normal, and it's hard to find anyone who is LGBT supporters, so it was a big deal for me. So he thought it's alright to try to pressure me into giving him certain sensual favors. Now keep in mind, at that age, I had no concept of what any of that was. I legitimately thought that babies just kind of came out of nowhere, although I had enough courage to say no, and after that incident, he would gaslight me into thinking that I made this all up whenever I would bring it up. Also, he would get angry at me. He would call me the Russian F word. The frog incident was the last straw. We had the small forest in my town, which was considered a tourist attraction. There was a shallow pit in the forest where people, mainly alcoholics and hobos, would throw all sorts of junk. We found an empty fish tank and a bottle with oil. He told me to hold the fish tank, so I did. Before I go further, I just wanted to say that I'm deeply ashamed of my actions. He placed the toad into the tank and proceeded to fill the tank with oil. The gravity of the situation hit me hard at this moment. Seeing this poor creature trying to make its way to the top while miserably failing, the thick black liquid dripping through its eyes made me cringe as I imagined how it would feel like if I was the one inside the fish tank. I remember after that I couldn't eat any wet food for weeks as it would remind me of that frog. I also remember my mom comforting me because I was nonstop crying, but not being able to explain why because of how guilty I felt. After that, I slowly was distracting myself from him, and then I moved to England, so he was pretty much a ghost of the past now. Although I still struggle mentally as I recently was diagnosed with BPD, which might explain why I tolerated him for so long. At least I learned to cut toxic at people after the first red flag. My mother's side of the family is fairly large. She has 3 brothers and 3 sisters, each married with several kids. So, When summer arrived and it was time for the annual family vacation, it meant endless hours of fun and entertainment for all of us. My grandparents were fairly wealthy, and every year, with a share of their fortune, they would rent a lake house, cabin, or beachside mansion for the entire family. For the year in question, they decided to rent a large, four-story lakeside home. It was complete with a dock, a game room, a movie theater, a vast kitchen, and even a tube slide system that went from floor to floor. What was supposed to be a blissful escape would soon become home to one of my worst memories. Before we dive deeper into the story, let me quickly explain the layout of the house, as it's important to understanding what happens later. The house was built on a very steep slope that led down to the lake. It was literally built horizontally off the side of the hill. On the part of the house that wasn't connected to the hill, long stilts supported the structure, reaching down to the base of the hill. For additional support, bricks were placed between the stilts, creating a large, cavernous room underneath the house. This area was only accessible by a cellar door at the bottom floor of the house. The room had no insulation, and the dirt floor was essentially just the bottom of the hill, filled with spiders, small rodents, and other creatures. The homeowners, who we rented from, advised us not to venture into this space, as it was a 10-foot drop to the ground with no ladder to help get back up. Essentially, anyone who found themselves in that room would be trapped in a tall, dark, cement hole. Now back to the story. After getting settled in and enjoying the first few nights with the family, the more mature members of the group, including me, my brother, and all my aunts, uncles, and their significant others, decided to play a game known as sardines. It's essentially the reverse of hide and seek. One person hides, and the rest of the players are seekers. All the lights in the house are turned off, creating complete darkness. The hider has a minute to hide, and once they're settled, the seekers begin their hunt. If a seeker finds the hider, they silently join the hider in the same spot until only one seeker remains. With that in mind, you can see how this could turn into an incredibly fun time. My Uncle Mike was the one selected to hide first. We turned off all the lights in the house, and after the 1-minute hiding period, the hunt began. My brother, aunts, uncles, and I searched the first couple of floors with no luck, checking under tables, in closets, and behind couches. After about 15 minutes of searching and nobody seemed to have found him, an idea sprouted in my head. Though I dismissed the thought at first, I couldn't stop thinking about that cellar door and that space that lay beneath the home. Being that I was on the younger end of the family, around 17 years old, I wanted to impress them by being the first one to find him. So I silently crept away from the group and down the last 2 stories I had to go to get to the bottom floor of the house where the cellar doors were. When I got there, I found my body physically shaking with adrenaline. And after opening the door that closed off the little closet-sized room that held the cellar doors, I was trembling with fear. They just looked so ominous. And in the dark lighting, I walked up to them and placed a hand on each of the handles. Before I even opened the door, I was able to hear scuffling and maniacal giggling from the room. This assured me even more that I had found him, and my fear turned into excitement when I learned of his presence. I flung the doors open and looked down into the dark abyss of the hole. I quietly whispered down at my uncle, telling him that I had found him and that I was going to drop down and join him. He just kept laughing and laughing, which really unnerved me because it was unlike him to do that sort of thing, without at least admitting he had been found or telling me to join him. Really wanting to be the first seeker to find him, I slowly began lowering myself down into the hole, hanging onto the ledge of the cellar door, and letting my feet dangle into the hole. I could hear his laughter getting louder and heard his footing shifting as he began to walk closer to me. A horrid stench assaulted me the second that I lowered the rest of my body into the hole. I still clung to the cellar door, not allowing myself to drop the extra 5 feet or so. Being that I was closer to the ground now, I could start to begin to see his shape, and it looked off. I couldn't make out facial features, but seeing his slouched posture and lanky arms made me hold onto the ledge of the cellar door for a moment longer in hesitation. In that moment, I heard my aunt's voice calling for me, telling me they had all found my uncle and that I was the last to find him. My mind didn't piece the two together instantly, but when it did, saying that I could feel my heart sink to my stomach wouldn't be an exaggeration. The immense, overwhelming fear that I felt in that moment, I have yet to feel ever again. Without a moment's hesitation, I pulled myself up out of the hole and instantly ran to my aunt calling for help, screaming about the man underneath the house. She looked confused at first, but sprung into action when she too heard the laughing from the hole. She called my uncles down while she phoned to the police and gave them my quick description of the man. But because we were in the middle of nowhere, it took them about 25 minutes to arrive. When they finally did, it was a flurry of red and blue lights. But what unnerved me the most was that a full SWAT team arrived as well. A dozen men poured into the home, which felt intense for what seemed like a mentally ill home invader. Within moments, they came out carrying a deranged-looking man in handcuffs. It wasn't until later on did I get the full details of the story. The man that they had arrested was indeed a mentally insane person with a warrant out for his arrest, for the mutilation of his ex-wife. I also found later that the stench that was coming out of the room was his feces. It appeared he had been trapped down there for several days. He claimed he had gotten himself stuck down there when he had initially broken into the cellar to elude police capture. It has been around 3 years since this incident, and its memory has become less and less intense with each passing day. However, some nights I lie awake at night thankful that I did not let go of that cellar's ledge. When I was 11, my family lived in Alaska, about 14 miles north of Anchorage. Once you leave the city, you're immediately in the wilderness. This happened in the summer of 1977, right after the original Star Wars came out, and I was completely obsessed with it. At the time, the town I lived in was more of a collection of roads and offshoots, with most people commuting to Anchorage for work. That's what my parents did. They both worked nights, so I spent a lot of time alone. I didn't have any siblings, and our house was about half a mile from the nearest paved road, surrounded by woods. I didn't have many friends nearby. There was one kid who lived at the end of our road. He was the closest neighbor, but still about 300 yards away. One afternoon that summer, I was watching TV when there was a knock at the door. I looked outside and saw the kid from down the street, but he wasn't alone. He had someone with him. I opened the door, and they told me that the other kid was his cousin, who had come up from out of state to visit. I don't remember his name, but I immediately felt nervous around him. He had long blonde hair, down to his shoulders, and was wearing a t-shirt under a thin leather vest. His eyes were dark, unnaturally dark, and I had this gut feeling that he was bad news. Even the kid from down the street seemed uneasy around him. They asked if they could come inside, but I told them no. That's when the kid with the dark eyes reached behind his back and pulled out the biggest knife I had ever seen. I swear it looked like a sword. It reminded me of the moment in Crocodile Dundee when he pulls out a massive knife and says, "That's not a knife. This is a knife." That's exactly what this kid had. I immediately told them I was going inside and shut the door. I went back to watching TV, trying to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. About an hour later, there was another knock at the door. I looked out the window and saw the kid again. This time, he was alone. The knock was louder this time. He called my name. The kid down the street must have told him who I was. I stayed quiet, hoping he would leave, but he didn't. Instead, he walked around the house. My mom had a sunroom where she kept plants, and it had large windows all along the wall. I saw him go to those windows, press his face against the glass, and cup his hands around his eyes, trying to peer inside. I stayed hidden, relieved that the lights were off and the TV was silent. After a while, he couldn't see anything, so he moved around the house, still holding that giant knife. I heard him tapping the blade on the wall as he circled. Then he started saying, "I know you're in there." I was terrified. Of course, he knew I was inside. I was 11, home alone. He knew I didn't leave, hop in a car and take off. I continued keeping low and quiet, hoping he might think I went to a friend's house somewhere else. How long could this psycho kid just circle the house? He was maybe 14. He would get bored quickly, right? No, this kept up for about an hour. I had gone all in on the I'm not home tactic, so I stayed quiet and made my way to the kitchen where our telephone was. This was 1977, remember, No cell phones, and our phone was attached to a wall in the kitchen. Luckily, it had a super long handset cord. I got it, stayed low to the floor, and called my mother at work. She took me seriously, but there was no way she could get home. My dad was in the Air Force, and they sure wouldn't let him skip out early to handle his son's crisis. I would have to ride it out. The sun had gone down, and by that, I mean it was barely peeking above the horizon. In the summer, the sun never went completely down in our area. The kid kept pacing around for another 30 minutes or so, and then suddenly was gone. Not being an idiot in a horror movie, I just stayed down and quiet. Eventually, my parents got home. I was still awake. They brushed it off as to say, see, nothing to worry about. I never hung out with the kid down the street again, and I pretty much stayed inside the remainder of the summer. There was something wrong with that kid. Maybe it was in my head, or maybe he would have done something absolutely brutal to me. Thankfully, I'll never know. When I was in 8th grade, my parents separated. One night, my mom packed up me and her, and we moved in with my grandpa without looking back. We ended up living there through my high school years. When my grandpa passed away, my parents officially divorced. My mom remarried, and we moved into the city with my stepfather. My grandpa lived on the first floor of the apartment, while the elderly couple who owned the place, family through marriage, lived on the second floor. The property also had a small in-law cottage in the back where my uncle lived. For some reason that I'll never understand, the back door to the building didn't have a lock. It opened into a landing with a locked and deadbolt door leading to our apartment, and then 2 sets of stairs. One led up to the locked and deadbolt door of the second floor apartment, and the other led down to the basement, which also had no lock. To get to the second floor apartment or basement, you had to pass through this landing. The basement was actually pretty nice, and at one point, they had started to convert it into its own apartment before ultimately deciding to make the in-law cottage instead. The basement had a full kitchen with an oven, sink, and refrigerator. The washer and dryer, which were shared by all of us, were also in the basement, along with general storage items. It was an open space except for a back room filled with storage. This back room had one of those saloon-style doors where you could see through the top and bottom. The storage area was longer than it was deep, so you couldn't really see much beyond the shelves. To actually see the room, you had to walk in and turn. One night, when I was 15, I had just taken a shower and noticed the laundry bin in the bathroom was full. I grabbed a bunch of laundry and headed down to the basement. It was late, but I figured I'd start the laundry and finish in the morning. I tossed the clothes onto the floor and began sorting when I was suddenly hit with a horrible feeling in my gut. The basement wasn't creepy at all. It was well lit with the kitchen and everything, and it should have been welcoming. But for some reason I couldn't explain, something just felt wrong. I don't know if anyone can relate, but it was that feeling when you just know you're being watched. I couldn't shake it and found myself staring at the saloon doors, the one part of the basement I couldn't see. I don't know why, but to reassure myself I wasn't just being ridiculous, I started walking toward the back room. As my hand reached out toward the doors, I stopped myself. As someone who's been a horror fan for as long as I can remember, I knew better. If this were a movie, I'd be yelling at myself not to go into that back room. I quickly pulled my hand back and ran up the stairs, leaving the laundry behind, into our apartment, where I locked the door. I immediately told my mom that something was off in the basement and that I was creeped out. Even though I'm not usually the type to get scared easily, she rolled her eyes at me and told me to go to bed. I ended up doing as I was told, though it took me a bit to shake the feeling and finally fall asleep. Later that night, my bladder woke me up and I stumbled out of my room to go to the bathroom. I didn't turn any of the lights on as I started making my way towards the bathroom because it usually woke up my grandpa and I didn't want to bother him. When I got closer to the bathroom, I noticed my mom standing in the doorway of her bedroom and something looked off, and it took me a moment to realize that she was clutching the phone. She then noticed me and whispered to me to get against the wall, which I did without hesitation. It took a few moments for the grogginess to wear off and my eyes to adjust to the darkness before I could see what she did. My mom's bedroom was immediately off of the kitchen. The kitchen was where the back door that led to the landing and the basement was located. The door had a tiny window up top with a small but thick curtain. It was thin enough that you could see that someone was outside of the door, but thick enough to not be able to make out any of the features of the person on the other side. But there was someone on the other side of the door, and every now and then the doorknob would move, and you could hear this scratching sound was on the other side. I have never been so afraid in my entire life. I'm not sure how I managed to do what I did next. It was like someone else had taken control over me entirely. I slid down against the wall that I was clinging to and started to crawl against it in the darkness towards the kitchen. My mom looked petrified, watching back and forth between me and the back door. She kept whispering for me to stop and go back, but I kept moving forward, low and against the wall, towards the counter where I carefully grabbed a butcher knife. I was shaking the whole time I moved with the knife in my hand on the ground next to the fridge, which was next to the door the man was trying to get into. I had this horrible feeling that I was going to be killed, but if I wasn't going to go down without a fight. It felt like I sat there forever in the darkness next to the door with my mom hiding in the bedroom doorway across from me, just waiting. But it was only for a few minutes. My mom had already called 911 before I had woken up and stumbled my way towards the bathroom. The lights from approaching squad cars soon filled the kitchen, and from the other side of the door, I could hear a sudden clamoring and commotion and the slam of the back screen bursting open as the would-be assailant took off running. It was around 3 a.m. when this happened, so it was completely dark outside, and we lived right by some train tracks and very thick bushes and trees that made it easy for the man to escape the cop that pursued him. The police came in and took statements from my mom and I. My grandpa, who was partially deaf, had managed to sleep through almost the entire thing until the police came through to search the apartment and make sure that we were okay. The outside of the door and the doorknob were both covered in deep scratches, like someone had been going at it with a knife trying to figure out how to get in. But that wasn't the most horrifying part to me. That was reserved for the basement. The clothes that I had brought down were not where I had left them, and they had been thrown about and disheveled, and the back room, the one with the swinging door that I had stopped myself from going in, the boxes that were out of view had also been thrown about, all opened, obviously gone through with some things missing, and there were some wrappers from food on the floor. He had been down there looking for something to steal. He was down there when I went down to do laundry. I had almost walked into that room, and based on what we had seen on the door, he had a knife. To this day, I can't help but find myself sometimes thinking about what would have happened if I had walked into that room. I have a very scary story to share. A few years ago, I was out of work and desperate for cash when I decided to look on Craigslist under the gigs section. I responded to several ads, ranging from painting to helping people move and cleaning. One Sunday morning, I got a call from someone who said they had some work available. The job was to clean a kitchen inside a small building that had recently been closed down, and the owner was renovating it. He needed me to show up in the evening, starting at 7 and working until around 1 or 2 in the morning. He said it was only for that night, but he'd pay me $200 in cash. That sounded great, and I had no problem with those hours since my last job was a graveyard shift anyway. The man I spoke with gave me the address, and I told him I'd be there on time. He sounded like a normal, nice guy. I arrived a little before 7 and approached the building. The place was in a downtown area, surrounded by other buildings, but it looked eerie. There were no windows, and no lights worked outside. It seemed like it might be an old bar or something that had closed down. I knocked on the large wooden door, and after a moment, I heard noise from inside. The door opened and a man stood there. He was tall, with a goatee and probably in his 50s. He greeted me with a smile and invited me inside. The room I entered was dimly lit by a single lamp. It had the feel of an old bar, and the space wrapped around a smaller room in the center. It looked like he had been painting the walls and working to fix up the rotting wooden bar. He led me to the center room, which was the kitchen. It was incredibly dirty. Old glasses and dishes were scattered everywhere. The oven had been pulled away from the wall, exposing rotting drywall behind it. Sawdust and dirt covered the surfaces. He told me that my job was to clean the kitchen and get as much done as possible before 2 a.m. I told him I'd work hard, and he pointed out some cleaning products on the floor near the wall, along with a few rags to scrub with. I asked if he had any gloves, and he said no, but that the sink in the corner still worked, and I could wash my hands whenever I needed to. It wasn't ideal, but I remembered the $200 he promised, so I pushed through the hesitation. He told me while I was cleaning, he would be working outside at the bar. I asked where I should start, and he said to begin with the baseboards around the room. I agreed, and he walked out. Fast forward about 2 hours. I was making some progress, but was getting very thirsty. I told myself I'd finish cleaning the baseboards, then take a break and ask if there was anything to drink. I kicked myself for not bringing a water bottle. Once I finished the task, I stood up and realized I hadn't heard him working outside at all. In fact, I hadn't heard anything for a while. I walked over to the door and opened it, only to be met by complete darkness. It was pitch black. Immediately, I felt a wave of nervousness and called out, "Hey man, I'm making good progress in here," expecting him to respond. But there was no reply. I looked around but could barely see anything at all. The lamp was gone. I looked back into the kitchen, which was bright and all lit up with all the lights on and working in the ceiling. I peered back out into the dark room. I began taking steps out into the room surrounding the kitchen. After taking about 10 whole steps, I stopped and was about to speak out again, when to my horror, the door slammed shut behind me and I was engulfed in blinding darkness. I could not see anything and I spun around waving my arms, walking back toward the kitchen door. My steps were small as I did not know what was in front of me. I was afraid I would run into something and I did. Waving my hands around in front of me, I hit something, not a door. I hit somebody's face. I scuttled backwards, not hearing anything. Whoever I had just touched didn't react. I backed up until I hit the back wall and I realized I must have been close to the entrance door to the building. I turned and I felt around for the doorknob. Luck was on my side as I quickly found it and pulled the door open. It was dark outside at this point and only a very small amount of moonlight came into the room, just enough to where I could see the man standing against the kitchen door with a blank expression on his face. I ran out the door and never looked back. That's the last time I used Craigslist to find work. What was that guy doing? What was he going to do? It makes me sick to think about it. I work for the United States Postal Service, and this is by far the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. One day, a coworker called in and said he couldn't make it to work for some reason. I was left with the responsibility of delivering all his mail on his route. I wasn't happy about it because his route took me through the old town of the big city I lived in. This old town was a tourist attraction of sorts, with very old Western-style buildings and a dirt road as the main street. All of the buildings in this area were shops, mostly for tourists. Most of these shops required the mail carrier to actually go inside and hand deliver the mail to the shop owners, which meant extra time and, of course, conversations I wasn't too fond of. One late afternoon, I entered a building and was immediately faced with a staircase. It wasn't optional to skip delivering the mail, so I reluctantly descended the old, winding metal staircase. It was uncomfortably long, and when I finally reached the bottom, I saw nothing but a very long hallway, dimly lit by old light bulbs flickering above me. Along the hallway were doors on both sides, similar to what you'd see in a hotel. I paused for a second, unsure of what to do next. A second later, I saw a man walk out of a door on the left side of the hall and quickly enter another room on the right side. I didn't have a chance to speak to him before he disappeared. After standing there for a few moments, I decided to walk down the hall and knock on the door he had entered. There was no response, so I waited. Suddenly, at the end of the hall where I had just come from, I saw the same man exit a door on the same side of the hall as me. He stepped into the middle of the hallway and just stood there, staring at me. I shouted, "I have some mail!" But before I could say anything else, he interrupted me by pulling out a long machete from behind him. At first, I thought it was a joke, but when he started sprinting toward me, I quickly realized it wasn't. I bolted into the room closest to me. The room looked like an old, dark wine cellar, and I immediately crawled underneath one of the old racks that stored wine. I thought, this can't be happening. But it was. The man entered the room, searching for me. He walked past my hiding spot, sniffling as he went, continuing down the rows of wine racks. I waited until I felt he was far enough away and then crawled out from beneath the rack. I made a run for the hall, sprinting back down to the staircase. Just as my foot hit the first metal step on the way up, I heard someone running fast down the hall behind me. I skipped steps, climbing as quickly as I could until I reached the top. Bursting outside onto the dirt road, I looked behind me. The man wasn't following. I jumped into my service vehicle and sped away from the old town as fast as I could. Later, I told my boss what had happened, and he said he would look into it and that I shouldn't worry about it. I told him I would never go back there again, and he didn't argue with me. At 24 years old, I went through an experience so strange and terrifying that I felt compelled to share it. It's completely true, and to this day, it remains the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. At the time, I was traveling to visit my best friend who had moved away to college in another state. One day, while driving through Ohio, I was cruising down a long stretch of highway when, out of nowhere, my car just died. I managed to steer it to the side of the road and eventually came to a complete stop. I hadn't run out of gas. I had just filled up in the last town. I tried restarting the car, and to my surprise, it actually started. I was confused and worried, wondering what had caused it to suddenly shut off. As I continued on, getting back up to speed, I started hearing a strange grinding noise coming from the car. I glanced up and noticed a sign indicating that there was a gas station and food at the next exit. The car was still moving, though with that unsettling noise, so I decided to get off the highway and stop at the gas station to check it out. When I exited, I saw just two places: a gas station with a single pump and an old-looking diner next to it. I pulled into the gas station, only to find it seemed closed. I checked my watch and was immediately thrown off. This was strange, especially since it was only 2:30 in the afternoon. What kind of gas station shuts down so early? I stepped out of the car and walked toward the glass door, cupping my hands around my eyes to peer inside. The station looked abandoned, with no sign of life. I turned around, scanning the area. It felt off, and I couldn't shake the unease creeping in as I noticed there were no other cars or people in sight. What's going on? Where am I? I checked my phone, but as expected, there was no service. I looked up at the sky, and it was eerily white, with clouds racing across it, and it was freezing outside. Feeling increasingly unsettled, I got back in my car and drove toward the diner. When I pulled up, I figured it was probably closed too, but to my surprise, just as I was about to reach the door, an elderly woman opened it and greeted me with a warm smile. Seeing another person was such a relief, and I figured I could finally get some hot food to calm my nerves. She asked if I was alone. "Would you like a booth?" she inquired. I told her I was by myself and that a booth sounded perfect. The diner had an old-fashioned vibe, and there wasn't another soul in sight. The woman led me to a seat, and I slid into the booth, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over me. I looked up at her, and she was wearing an old apron with stains all over it. Her teeth were old, cracked, and yellow. She had a pleasant voice, though, and she seemed to be a very nice person. She handed me a menu and asked what I'd like to drink. I told her a Coke or Pepsi would be great, and she smiled and said she'd be right back. I sat there looking at this menu, and there was dirt on it. It looked like it had been sitting outside for years. I cleaned it off, and the food that was on it that was available was very basic. Burger, chicken sandwich, fries, salad. That was pretty much it. I decided to order the burger with some fries. A few minutes passed, and she hadn't returned with my drink yet. I was anxious to ask her if there was a mechanic around that could look at my car. A few more minutes passed, and I started thinking, what the hell is going on back there? I yelled out, "Hello," in as nice a voice as possible. I got no response. At this point, I was annoyed and I got up. I walked over to the door that led into the back cooking area and swung it open, about to ask where my drink was. To my surprise, the back of the diner was empty. There was no cooks, no fryers, no grills, nothing. The woman was nowhere in sight. It was obvious that this diner was not a running establishment, and I felt sick to my stomach. I started to walk into the back area when I heard the scariest, most evil old lady laugh I've ever heard. I stopped and backed up out the door into the front. I turned and walked out the door I came in from. I ran down the 3 steps and over to my car and got inside. Thank God my car started and I floored it out of there. As I was driving away, I looked into my rearview mirror and saw the woman standing in the middle of the road. A few years ago, on Friday the 13th, something happened that I don't expect many people to believe. The night before, we had been celebrating my best friend's 21st birthday. At the time, we were all around that age. I'm now 26, and the events from that night still send a chill down my spine. Back then, my group of friends was small but tight-knit, and we had planned to head to our local pub to celebrate. We spent the evening enjoying ourselves, chatting, and sharing experiences. The fun was the most important part. We got to the pub around 8:30 p.m. and were kicked out at midnight when it closed. Afterward, we hung out outside for a bit before walking home. All of us pretty drunk. The night was quiet and dark, but thankfully not stormy. My house sat on a slight hill in what I thought was a safe neighborhood before this happened. At the time, I was living with my aunt. As I walked down the street, I noticed someone dressed completely in black out of the corner of my eye. They had a hood pulled over their head, making it nearly impossible to see their face in the dim light. But they looked to be in their 30s or 40s, with a muscular build. They were on the street across from mine, heading toward the intersection I was walking through. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming they were just heading home like everyone else. By the time I was almost home, around 1:30 a.m., I turned around and saw the same person following me. A sense of alarm hit me, especially since I'd been drinking earlier and was already a bit on edge. I've always been paranoid about walking alone late at night, so I started to speed up, hoping to create some distance. To my surprise, the man picked up his pace too. That's when I realized I was in a fight or flight situation. Instead of trying to be tough and risk something bad happening, I chose to run. My house was on the corner, so I sprinted for it with him right behind me. I slammed the gate shut as soon as I got onto my driveway, rushed inside through the back door, and tried to lock it as fast as I could. As I was locking everything, I noticed something strange. The motion sensor light we had connected to the garage didn't turn on when I passed it. It should have, since we always made sure the batteries were fresh and the light was extremely sensitive. The next morning, I went outside to check it, and to my shock, I found that the light had been deliberately covered and turned toward the garage, preventing it from activating. A cold, sharp pain hit my chest as I realized that the man had far more sinister plans in mind. I went back inside to ask my family about it, and none of them had touched the light since I left for the pub. What happened that Friday the 13th would be the first and last time I ever saw that man. What still confuses me, even to this day, is how he knew where I lived. Last New Year's, my 2 best friends and I decided it would be fun to rent a house for the night. We weren't into big parties, but we enjoyed hanging out in a small group. Plus, all of us lived in dorms, so having a place to ourselves for once seemed like the perfect idea, even without the party. Jason, one of my friends, rented an Airbnb just outside of town. I carpooled with Christian, my other friend, and we met Jason there on New Year's Eve around noon. The place was more of a cabin than a typical house. It had that all-wood, rustic cabin look, with the usual features you'd expect. There were a few other cabins around, but they were spaced far apart, so it felt like we were out there by ourselves. The inside wasn't anything fancy, but this was one of the cheaper options, so none of us expected luxury. We spent the day relaxing in the living room, talking and hanging out. Around 6, Christian went to the store to grab some snacks and drinks. While Jason and I were still sitting in the living room, we heard a knock at the door. We exchanged confused looks. It was odd for anyone to be out there, knocking on the door of an Airbnb. I got up, peeked through the peephole, and saw a man standing outside. The door had a metal latch, so I flipped it over and opened it just enough to see him. I wouldn't usually answer the door to a stranger, but since we were staying in someone else's house, I wasn't sure if it was the host or something. The man looked at me with a scowl. He seemed angry, and it became clear as soon as he spoke. In a rude and condescending tone, he told me that we needed to be quiet tonight and not disturb the neighborhood. His tone was almost threatening, as if we had already been making noise, but we hadn't done anything loud, nor were we planning to. And with the houses being so spread out, there's no way he could have heard anything unless we were setting off fireworks. I wasn't in the mood for an argument, so I just said, "Sure," and shut the door. But not even a second later, he banged on it again. I ignored him this time and made a face at Jason, like this guy was insane. After a moment, we heard him leave. When Christian returned, we told him about the encounter, and he didn't even believe us at first. The next 3 hours flew by as we watched a movie and played some games on Jason's Switch. As midnight approached, we heard something outside. It sounded like something dropped, followed by the sharp sound of glass shattering right outside the door. We all jumped up and rushed to the window. The same guy from earlier was standing by Christian's car, which now had glass all over it from his shattered windshield. He was holding a metal baseball bat and appeared to be in some sort of frenzy, pacing and acting erratically. Christian was furious and headed straight for the door to confront him. Jason and I tried to stop him, but before we could even get to the doorway, a gunshot rang out through the cabin. I froze, knowing what had likely happened, but I was almost relieved when I saw Christian sprint back inside and lock the door behind him. A few more shots followed, hitting the side of the cabin, and then the man started swinging the bat against the front door. Then, just as quickly as it all began, the man ran off. After the police investigated, it turned out he wasn't even a neighbor of the Airbnb. No one knows who he was, where he came from, or why he went completely berserk. It was a dangerously unpredictable encounter that nearly cost us our lives. I've always believed that true enlightenment comes from within, but I never imagined it would be buried so far beneath layers of fear and betrayal. The spiritual retreat that promised inner peace nearly cost me my life, and what I found instead was a darkness I never knew existed. It all started with a simple ad. Find yourself in the forests of Oregon. 7 days of meditation, nature walks, and self-discovery. It seemed like the perfect escape. I had been feeling lost, overwhelmed by the chaos of my everyday life, desperate for clarity. This retreat promised to be the reset I desperately needed. I arrived at the secluded location on a crisp autumn morning. The air was rich with the scent of pine, and a light mist clung to the trees, giving the entire forest an otherworldly atmosphere. It felt magical, like stepping into a different world entirely. Our group was small, just 10 of us, all in search of something we couldn't quite name. We were greeted by Martin, our guide for the week. He exuded calm, speaking in a soft, reassuring tone that immediately put me at ease. But his eyes were intense, almost unnervingly so, like he could peer straight into your soul. "Welcome," he said, his arms wide open. "You've taken the first step on a journey of transformation. Here, you will shed your old selves and be reborn." Looking back, those words should have raised red flags, but at the time, they sounded exactly like what I needed to hear. The first few days went exactly as I had hoped. We meditated at dawn, took long, peaceful walks through the forest, and shared our innermost thoughts and feelings in group sessions. Martin led us through exercises designed to break down emotional barriers and help us reconnect with our true selves. But as the days passed, I started to notice subtle shifts. Martin's teachings grew more intense, increasingly focused on letting go of our pasts. He spoke about severing ties with the outside world, about fully committing to the new path he was guiding us down. Some of the group members seemed to fall deeper under Martin's influence, hanging on his every word. Their eyes would glaze over with what I can only describe as adoration. I watched Sarah, a quiet accountant from Michigan, give away her wedding ring, saying it was a symbol of her old life. I tried to dismiss the growing unease in my chest. Wasn't this what I had come for? To change, to see the world from a new perspective. But deep down, something told me this wasn't right. On the fifth night, Martin announced we would have a special ceremony. Tonight, he said, his eyes gleaming in the firelight, we will transcend the physical and touch the divine. We gathered in a clearing deep in the forest. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the proceedings. Martin began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, and the others joined in. The sound rose and fell, hypnotic and unsettling. Then Martin produced a small vial of liquid. This, he said, will help us see the truth. It will open our minds to the universe. He began to pass the vial around. I watched as one by one, my fellow retreat ants drank without hesitation. When it came to me, I hesitated. Martin's eyes locked onto mine, challenging, almost threatening. I pretended to drink, holding the liquid in my mouth and spitting it out when no one was looking. Almost immediately, I could see the effects on the others. Their eyes glazed over, and they began to sway to some unheard rhythm. Martin started talking about shedding our old selves, about being reborn. But his words had taken on a sinister edge. He spoke of sacrifice, of leaving behind not just our old lives, but our old bodies. As I watched in horror, two of the men in our group began to lead Sarah towards a crude altar they had constructed. She went willingly, a beatific smile on her face. Martin raised a knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. In that moment, I knew I had to act. I couldn't just stand by and watch this happen, but I was outnumbered, and they were in some kind of trance. I needed help. I slipped away while they were distracted, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they would hear it. I ran through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to get away to find help. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a small creek. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to civilization. The forest was alive with night sounds, every snapping twig making me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, sure that at any moment I would see Martin or one of his followers pursuing me. Finally, I saw lights through the trees, a small town, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I burst out of the forest onto a quiet street, probably looking like a mad woman. Dirty, disheveled, wild-eyed with fear. I found a diner that was still open and burst in, gasping for breath. The few patrons looked up in shock. "Please," I managed to say between gulps of air. "I need help. There are people in danger." The waitress, bless her heart, didn't hesitate. She called the police immediately. As we waited for them to arrive, she sat me down, brought me water, and listened as I poured out my story. I could see the disbelief in her eyes, but to her credit, she didn't dismiss me. When the police arrived, I told them everything about Martin, the retreat, the ceremony. I could tell they were skeptical, but something in my desperate plea must have convinced them to at least check it out. They asked me to lead them back to the retreat site. The journey back through the dark forest was terrifying, every shadow seeming to hide a threat. But with the solid presence of the officers beside me, I found the strength to go on. We reached the clearing just as dawn was breaking, but it was empty. The altar was gone, the fire nothing but cold ashes. There was no sign of Martin or any of the others. The police searched the area thoroughly, but found nothing to corroborate my story. No vials of strange liquid, no knives, no evidence of any kind of ceremony. They took me back to town, questioning me further. I could see the doubt in their eyes growing with each passing moment. In the end, they told me they would keep investigating. But without any evidence or other witnesses, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to go home, to seek help if I was having trouble. I left Oregon feeling shaken and confused. Had I imagined it all? The ceremony, the knife, Sarah being led to the altar. It all seemed so real. But with each passing day, as I tried to readjust to my normal life, it began to feel more and more like a vivid nightmare. I tried to find information about Martin or the retreat online, but it was as if they had never existed. The website where I had found the original ad was gone. I reached out to the hotel where I had stayed the night before the retreat, but they had no record of my stay. Weeks turned into months, too. I went to therapy trying to make sense of what had happened. My therapist suggested that stress and isolation might have caused me to have a break with reality. Part of me wanted to believe her, to accept that it had all been in my head. It would have been easier that way, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been real. The fear I experienced that night in the forest was far too real, too intense to have been a figment of my imagination. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I would wake up drenched in cold sweat, convinced I could still hear Martin's voice chanting in that strange, foreign tongue. I never returned to another spiritual retreat. The peace and clarity I sought in those woods remained elusive. Instead, I was left with a constant sense of unease, a deep, gnawing feeling that the world around me wasn't as it appeared. Every time I saw a missing persons report, I couldn't help but wonder if they too had gone looking for enlightenment, only to stumble upon something far darker than they ever expected. I thought about Sarah, about the others in the group. Where were they now? Had they truly been reborn as Martin had promised? Or had they met a much darker fate? In the end, the experience changed me, but not in the way I had hoped when I first saw that ad. I learned that sometimes the greatest dangers don't come from the outside world, but from our own desperate desire to believe in something, anything that promises to give our lives purpose. I still meditate from time to time, still search for moments of peace and clarity, but now I do it on my own terms, keeping my distance from anyone who claims to have all the answers. The forest that once seemed so full of potential now feels menacing, hiding secrets I'm not sure I want to uncover. And every so often, when the wind rustles through the trees, I swear I can hear Martin's voice calling me back to that clearing, whispering promises of rebirth. But I know now that some offers are too good to be true, and some paths of self-discovery lead to places from which there is no return. I've never told anyone this story because, honestly, I didn't think anyone would believe me. One evening, I was home alone and had gone to bed for the night. I live with my partner and 2 indoor cats, but she was out of state on a business trip. I woke up in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure what time it was, but it was pitch black, and my body felt freezing. Normally, I like it cool when I sleep, so I keep the temperature around 70 degrees or lower, especially since I live in Central Texas. But this time, it felt different. I was cold, but still wrapped in blankets. It was summer, and it doesn't get cold here at night. When I grabbed my phone to check the time, it seemed to be off. I pressed the power button, but it didn't turn on. I was half asleep, so I just shrugged it off and walked out of my bedroom to adjust the thermostat. But then I noticed something odd. The cats weren't around. This was strange because they're usually on the bed or nearby. I walked over to the thermostat to adjust it, but the power to the thermostat, I have a Nest, was off, and it seemed like the power to the entire house was out. I peeked out the upstairs window to see if any of my neighbors were having power issues, and I saw that all of their outdoor lights were working just fine. From the time I woke up to this point, maybe only 1 or 2 minutes had passed. I decided to go downstairs to grab some water, but I froze when I saw a glow of light coming from the first floor. I couldn't see it from upstairs, but as I walked closer to the stairs, I noticed it. This didn't make sense because the power was out upstairs, but there was light coming from downstairs. So, I started walking down the stairs and began hearing a faint humming noise. It had a high-pitched tone with occasional low pulses, almost like a muffled weed whacker being throttled at random intervals. As I continued down the stairs, I saw a dark, slowly moving figure in the room at the bottom. The moment I took another step, it felt like I had walked off the edge of a cliff or was being sucked into the floor. That's really the best way that I can explain it too, because I don't remember what happened after that. I just lost a feeling from my body. My next memory is waking up again to the sound of my phone's alarm, and everything seemed back to normal. I sat there in bed, the cats back to being lazy in bed next to me, and tried to think about the 2-minute incident that happened in the middle of the night. I am not a sleepwalker, and I was definitely not dreaming. My security systems app shows the time whenever a door is opened or closed, and I realized that my security system was disarmed on the app and that the front door had been opened and closed several times throughout the night too. I pulled up my security footage from the exterior cameras and was surprised to learn that there was zero footage from the night. But, the motion sensors reacted to a random car driving by around 10 p.m., and then the next thing is another random car in the morning. So someone or something walked in and out of my front door, but the cameras didn't capture any footage. My neighbor across the street had a good security system that points at my house, so I asked him if I could review the footage from his cameras. I told him some made-up story about how I thought someone had broken into my truck. Anyway, he said it was weird because when he pulled up the footage from that night, his cameras didn't record anything either, just a time gap once again. My first thought was that I was sleepwalking and that the memory was a dream, but it just couldn't have been. When I looked out of the window in the middle of the night, I distinctly recall the red pickup truck parked the wrong direction in front of the neighbor's house. I always notice when cars are parked left wheel to the curb because I've gotten a ticket for this in the past. The truck was not there before I went to sleep based on the footage, but was there in the morning based on the footage again. So the truck was there when I saw it in the middle of the night, which means I definitely woke up in the middle of the night cold as ice. No cats, no working phone, or no thermostat. Saw the truck out of the window and then got warped by something on the stairs. A couple of additional things were different in the house too. The security system was disarmed, and I definitely armed it before going to bed. The light was still on downstairs, and that was absolutely off before I went to bed. My whole body as well smelled like burnt marshmallows. I know this is weird, but it's really how it smelled. And lastly, my 55-gallon fish tank that sits at the bottom of the stairs in the entryway was missing 2/3 of the water. I mean, seriously, where the hell did 40+ gallons of water just disappear to? The whole area around the tank was bone dry too, and the fish were fine. I seriously don't know what the hell happened, but I've done some research and I've looked into this since then, and everything seems to point towards some sort of abduction experience. The soft sweep of the lighthouse beacon was the only sound that cut through the oppressive silence of the island. I stood at the window of the keeper's quarters, my eyes tracing the rhythmic sweep of light across the restless sea. It had been 3 weeks since I took this job, eager for the solitude and the chance to escape my troubled past. But as I gazed out into the vast, dark expanse, a shiver ran down my spine. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. And I was starting to suspect that this lighthouse held secrets far darker than anything I'd left behind. My name is Daniel Cooper, and I never intended to become a lighthouse keeper. But when life gives you one crushing blow after another, sometimes you'll grasp at anything that offers a way out. After losing my job, my marriage, and almost my sanity in just a year, the ad for a temporary lighthouse keeper on a remote island seemed like a godsend. The interview had been short and over the phone. The Coast Guard officer who hired me was more concerned about how I'd handle isolation than any real qualifications. "It's just for 3 months," he'd said. "Maintain the light, keep the logs, and report anything unusual. Think you can handle that?" I jumped at the opportunity. 3 months of peace and quiet, away from the chaos of my life, sounded perfect. If only I'd known what I was truly walking into. The island was smaller than I imagined, just a rocky outcrop rising from the sea. The lighthouse itself was imposing, its white tower standing stark against the gray sky. As the boat that brought me pulled away, I felt a brief moment of anxiety. I was truly alone now. The first few days passed quietly. I learned the equipment, studied the logs from previous keepers, and fell into a routine. During the day, I'd handle maintenance and explore the small island. At night, I'd ensure the beacon stayed lit, losing myself in books or in my own thoughts. But on the 5th night, I noticed something strange. I was doing my final check of the beacon before turning in when I saw it, a flickering light on the water where no light should be. It glowed with an eerie green hue, bobbing on the waves like some bioluminescent jellyfish. I watched it for nearly an hour, entranced. It seemed to move, but not in the erratic way that a piece of flotsam would. No, this light was moving with purpose, zigzagging across the water in a pattern I couldn't quite make sense of. Finally, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But a quick glance at the logbook revealed something unsettling. Similar lights had been reported by keepers for decades, always described the same way. Greenish glow, purposeful movement, sudden disappearance. In the weeks that followed, the sightings became more frequent. Sometimes it was just one light. Other times, a whole cluster of them, dancing across the water like a strange, otherworldly ballet. I found myself spending more and more time by the window, waiting for them to appear. But it wasn't just the lights. Strange things started happening on the island itself. Tools would go missing, only to turn up in places I knew I hadn't left them. I'd wake up to find intricate patterns drawn in the sand around the lighthouse, too precise to have been formed by wind or waves. And sometimes, in the deep of night, I'd hear whispers, words in a language I didn't recognize, seeming to come from the very walls of the lighthouse itself. I tried to rationalize it all. Isolation can play tricks on the mind, I told myself. The lights were probably just bioluminescent algae. The missing tools the result of my own forgetfulness. The patterns in the sand formed by animals I hadn't yet seen. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Something was happening on this island, something beyond the realm of normal explanation. It all came to a head on the night of the full moon, exactly 3 weeks after I'd arrived. The sea was unusually calm, a mirror-like surface reflecting the swollen moon above. I was in the lantern room, polishing the lens, when I heard it. A sound like massive stones grinding against each other, coming from the base of the lighthouse. Heart pounding. I made my way down the spiral staircase. The sound grew louder with each step, until it was all I could hear, drowning out even the sound of my own ragged breathing. As I reached the bottom, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. The floor was opening. There's no other way to describe it. The solid stone was splitting apart, revealing a yawning chasm beneath. And rising from that impossible depths was a sight that nearly drove me mad on the spot. It was a creature, if such a word can even apply to the monstrosity I saw. Massive tentacles, each as thick as a tree trunk, writhed and twisted as they emerged from the pit. They were covered in pulsing, bioluminescent spots, the same eerie green eyes seen out on the water. Behind the tentacles came a bulbous body, its flesh translucent enough that I could see shadowy organs pulsing within. And then I saw its eyes, dozens of them, perhaps 100, covering its body like a horrible constellation. They all turned to focus on me at once. And in that moment, I knew true terror. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there frozen in horror. But I couldn't move. It wasn't paralysis born of fear, but something else. The creature was holding me in place somehow, its gaze penetrating into the very core of my being. And then it spoke, not with words, but directly into my mind. Images and sensations flooded my consciousness. Ancient cities beneath the waves, civilizations rise and fall, secrets of the universe both beautiful and terrible. I saw the true purpose of the lighthouse, not as a beacon for ships, but as a signal for something much older and more powerful. It became clear to me then, this creature, this entity, had been here long before humans ever set foot on this island. The lighthouse had been built on its resting place. The keepers had been, unknowingly, guardians of a slumbering god. How long I stood there, my mind overwhelmed by the entity's presence, I can't say. Could have been minutes or perhaps hours. But eventually, mercifully, it released its grip on my mind. The tentacles withdrew, slipping back into the chasm. The grinding sound returned as the floor sealed itself, erasing all trace of the horror I had witnessed. I stumbled back to the keeper's quarters, my thoughts a chaotic blur. A part of me wanted to run, to swim if I had to, anything to escape this cursed island. But another, deeper part of me knew it was pointless. I had been chosen for this, whether I wanted it or not. I was now the guardian of something ancient, something beyond human understanding. The next morning, I filed my usual report to the Coast Guard. Nothing unusual to report, I said, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. But what could I tell them? Who would believe me? Now, as I sit here writing this account, I can see the green lights dancing on the waves once again. I know what they truly are. They are not bioluminescent algae or strange fish, but extensions of the entity that sleeps beneath the lighthouse. They're searching, always searching, for something beyond my comprehension. My 3-month contract is almost up, but I know I won't be leaving. How could I, knowing what I know? Someone has to watch over the lighthouse, not for the ships that pass, but for the thing that sleeps below. So I'll remain, keeping my solitary vigil. And if you ever find yourself on a ship passing a remote lighthouse, and you see strange green lights in the water, don't look too closely. Some secrets are better left in the depths, where they belong. The wheel jerked violently in my hands as the car hit another deep rut, sending a spray of mud across the windshield. I cursed under my breath, squinting through the rain-smeared glass at the barely visible road ahead. This shortcut was turning out to be anything but a time saver, and as the sky darkened with the approaching night, I regretted my decision to veer off the main highway. I'd been driving for hours, trying to make it to my sister's wedding rehearsal dinner, but the storm had slowed me down considerably. In a moment of frustration, I had followed my GPS's suggestion for a quicker route through back roads. Now, as my car struggled through the muddy path that barely resembled a road, I was painfully aware of how foolish that choice had been. The car lurched again, and this time I felt something give way underneath. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere as the rain pounded relentlessly on the roof. No, I muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine whined, but refused to start. I slumped back in my seat, the reality of my situation sinking in. I was stuck on an unfamiliar road, in the middle of a storm with no cell service. The rehearsal dinner was definitely out of the question now. As I weighed my limited options, a flash of light caught my eye. Headlights, approaching from behind. Relief washed over me. Maybe this Good Samaritan could help me get back on track, or at least get me to a place where I could call for a tow. The vehicle, an old pickup truck, pulled up beside me. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a man in his 50s, his weathered face creased with concern. "Having some trouble there?" he called out over the sound of the rain. I nodded, grateful for the potential help. "Yeah, I think I hit something. The car just died on me." He peered past me at the car and then glanced back down the road. "This stretch can be tricky if you don't know it. Tell you what, why don't I give you a tow to my place? It's just up the road a bit. Got a phone you can use, and you can wait out the storm there." Every stranger danger warning I'd ever heard flashed through my mind. But as another crack of thunder shook the sky, I realized I didn't have many options. I was already drenched from my brief attempt to check under the hood, and the thought of spending the night in my car was unappealing. "That would be great. Thank you," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The man introduced himself as Earl, as he helped me hook up my car to his truck. His manner was friendly, almost overly so, but I chalked it up to small-town hospitality. As we set off down the muddy road, Earl kept up a steady stream of chatter, asking about where I was from and where I was headed. "A wedding," he said when I mentioned my sister. "Well, ain't that nice? Family's important, nothing more important than family." There was something in the way he said it that made me uneasy, but I brushed the feeling aside. We drove for what seemed like much longer than the just up the road Earl had mentioned. The rain had tapered off, but the sky was now pitch black, making it impossible to get my bearings. Finally, we turned onto a narrow driveway, coming to a stop in front of a large farmhouse. The paint was peeling and the porch sagged, but warm light spilled from the windows, a beacon in the darkness. "Home sweet home," Earl said, killing the engine. "Let's get you inside and dried off." As we approached the house, the front door swung open. A woman stood there, her thin frame silhouetted against the light. Something about her posture, the way she held herself, sent a chill down my spine. "Martha, we've got a guest," Earl called out. Poor thing got stuck in the storm. Martha's eyes flicked from Earl to me, then back again. She nodded once, stepping aside to let us in. The interior of the house was cluttered but clean, with an odd mix of modern appliances and antique furniture. The walls were covered in old photographs, their subjects staring out with solemn expressions. "You must be freezing," Martha said, her voice surprisingly soft. "Why don't you go get changed? I've got some old clothes that might fit you." Before I could protest, she was ushering me up a narrow staircase. The upper floor was dark, lit only by a single bare bulb at the end of the hallway. Martha pointed me towards a small bedroom, handing me a bundle of clothes before disappearing back downstairs. As I changed into the musty-smelling but dry clothes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The room felt wrong somehow. The furniture was old-fashioned, almost like a museum display. And was it my imagination, or were those scratch marks on the inside of the door? I made my way back downstairs, my wet clothes bundled under my arm. Earl and Martha were in the kitchen, their heads close together in whispered conversation. They fell silent as I entered, both turning to look at me with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. "Feel better?" Earl asked, gesturing for me to sit at the kitchen table. "Martha's just warming up some soup. You must be hungry after your ordeal." I wasn't, actually. My stomach was in knots, every instinct screaming at me to get out of this house. But I smiled and thanked them, not wanting to seem ungrateful. So I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "About that phone?" Earl and Martha exchanged a look. "Oh, wouldn't you know it," Earl said, shaking his head. "The storm must have knocked out the lines. Happens all the time out here." My heart sank. No phone meant no way to call for help. I was completely at the mercy of these strangers. As Martha set a bowl of soup in front of me, I noticed her hands. They were covered in small scars, like she'd been repeatedly scratched by something or someone. "You've got a lovely home," I said, desperate to fill the uncomfortable silence. "Have you lived here long?" "Oh, ages," Earl replied, his eyes taking on a faraway look. "This house has been in the family for generations. Lots of history here. Lots of secrets too," Martha added, her voice barely above a whisper. I nearly choked on my soup. "What do you mean?" Earl laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, every old house has its secrets. Isn't that right, Martha?" Martha nodded, that same eerie smile playing on her lips. "Indeed, and sometimes those secrets have a way of resurfacing." The conversation that followed was one of the most unsettling of my life. Earl and Martha spoke of the house's history, of family members long dead, in a way that made it sound as if they were still present. They referred to events from the distant past as if they had happened yesterday. As the night wore on, my unease grew. I made excuses about being tired, hoping they would show me to a guest room, but Earl insisted I stay up, regaling me with more stories about the house and its inhabitants. It was well past midnight when I heard it. A thump from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I froze, my eyes darting to Earl and Martha. They showed no reaction, continuing their conversation as if nothing had happened. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Earl cocked his head, feigning confusion. "Hear what?" "That noise from upstairs. It sounded like—" "Oh, that's just the house settling," Martha interrupted, her tone dismissive. "These old places make all sorts of noises." But I knew what I'd heard, and as the night went on, the noises didn't stop. Creaks, thumps, and once what sounded horribly like a muffled scream. By the time Earl showed me to a guest room, I was a nervous wreck. The room was small and stuffy, with a narrow bed pushed up against the wall. As Earl bid me goodnight, I noticed him locking the door from the outside. Sleep was impossible. I lay in the dark, every creak of the house setting my nerves on edge. The photographs on the walls seemed to watch me, their eyes following my every move. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I had to get out of this house, car or no car. Quietly, I gathered my things and tried the door. To my surprise, it was unlocked. The house was silent as I crept downstairs. I had just reached the front door when a floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around to find Earl standing there, a sad smile on his face. "Leaving so soon?" he asked. "But you haven't met the rest of the family yet?" As if on cue, figures began to emerge from the shadows. Men and women in outdated clothes, their faces pale and gaunt. With a jolt of horror, I recognized them from the photographs. I ran out the door, down the driveway, not daring to look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. When I finally stopped, the house was nowhere in sight. It took hours of walking before I reached the main road, where a kindly truck driver gave me a ride to the nearest town. I reported my experience to the local police, but they just shook their heads. There was no record of an Earl or Martha living in the area, and no farmhouse matching my description. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps, still see those ghostly figures emerging from the shadows. And I wonder about that house, standing alone in the darkness, waiting for its next unsuspecting guest. When I was around 13 or 14, my best friend's house was always where I ended up staying. I practically lived at her little trailer during the summer, spending entire seasons there. I remember one particularly rough winter when we got about 6 inches of snow during winter break. Naturally, I wanted to spend my time off at her place, and it wasn't surprising when the snow and ice made it impossible to get home for a few days. The cold weather turned into cozy days of hot chocolate, movies, crafting, and most importantly, a wood-burning furnace to keep us warm. One evening, after we'd finished up making some crafts, the night fell quickly. To set the scene, the trailer had around 7 rooms, a bathroom, for bedrooms, a kitchen, and a back extension that served as the living room. This room faced the woods, which stretched for miles, something I knew well because we often explored them. The extension had a couch, the furnace, a TV, a small stand, a chair, and 2 sliding glass doors that led out to a small deck. Her dad kept the logs out there, and the cats would often sit by the door while they ate. Just past the porch, slightly out of view from the glass doors, was her father's workshop where he would spend most of his days and nights, only coming inside to add more wood to the fire. My friend and I spent a lot of time in that extension because her bedroom was small. The couch in the living room could fold out into a full-sized bed, and we kept blankets inside the couch so we could instantly hop into bed whenever we were ready to sleep. That particular winter night, we passed out under several layers of blankets, right across from the warm wood stove. I awoke groggily, disturbed by the cold air of the door opening as her dad walked into the room, lit by the glow of the TV. A light my friend insisted on keeping on to fall asleep. It wasn't until I heard him walking across the floor that I realized something was happening. I could see myself lying on my side next to my friend, aware that I was no longer awake. I knew I couldn't be conscious because I was floating, watching myself from above as I reached the ceiling. The familiar smell of burning would fill the air, and I could see the sparks from the fire as her dad laid a few logs onto the stove. The faint snow boot prints that had melted on the carpet were still visible as he stopped by the bed to say goodnight to us, his tired voice barely audible. After that, he slid the door open to head back out into his workshop for another night of work. I lay there, watching our still bodies and the crackling fire for what felt like an hour before something caught my attention. A dark shape, like a shadow, slid into view just outside the glass doors from the side of the bed. Even with the vivid, colorful reflections of the TV lights dancing across the glass, the figure was completely void of light, blending into the darkness. It stood still and silent, its presence unsettling, as I could only watch from above. Somehow it looked like the spot sucked all the rays into the total darkness of a black hole that was only there in one spot and one shape. It was a few minutes of complete silence and dead staring at this mass before a shape began to appear. A hand sliding into my line of sight and moving the handle to the sliding door. A slow, jerky movement turned the handle, and a creak sounded across the walls as the door slid along the frame and cracked far enough open for the darkness to slide through. The familiar cold climate greeted me as my body below my eyes shivered under the covers. The creature had to duck down and bend in order to fit into the glass door frame, which was well above the height of a person. Only as it moved past the reflecting glass did the mass begin to portray the figure of a man. The shape was similar to a human, still devoid of features, entirely black, and even the color in the room seemed to have been absorbed into the void of its body. The thing walked unsteadily, as if it was unable to control its body, like a man with slinkies as feet. With each step, its length seemed to stretch and bend like it was unable to control the way it portioned out. It bended back and forth, closer and farther with each inch, closer it stomped. As the figure began to illuminate, what appeared to be the dark shadow of a hat upon its head rocked back and forth. The figure abruptly stopped and vibrated as it straightened and reached the edge of the bed where I laid closest to the doors. His body stayed straight, but only the middle section bent, so the top part of its frame was facing directly down, face to face with my closed sleeping eyes. The dark hand jerkily pulled up and made a formed line above where the eyebrows would be if the face of the creature wasn't a black hole, as if it was helping shield the TV light to look at my features better. And just like that, it stayed for another hour perhaps. I could see myself shaking below and sweat reflected pools of light towards me. It was as if my subconscious knew that this mass inflicted pure terror and stillness and worry into my body, and yet I could do nothing but watch myself cold and shaking below. I had no hands to shake myself awake, to pinch myself from this nightmare. All I could do was stare and watch as this thing stared, not so much as breathe or move the bed frame in the slightest, just observing me silently in the night. When my brain tried to rack itself around all I could possibly think of as to how something like this could exist, how was this real? Then, just as insanely and unrealistically as it had appeared, all of a sudden the creature straightened and hurriedly stumbled toward the door. The frame moved, opened and closed as he slid sideways out of view of the porch door. A slam echoed outside as the workshop door opened, hitting the wall. The familiar footsteps walked onto the porch, stepping in the ghosts of where the creature's feet had stepped. The sound of the boots marched to the door inside. My friend's dad, unbothered, peered into the reflecting glass before sliding to open the door, adding another log to the wood stove. He left the room after completing his task and headed toward his room to sleep for the rest of the night. I watched as this familiar scene calmed my sleeping face as the snow once again melted into boot prints on the floor, realizing that the thing had never left a mark in or on the carpet. I sat floating for hours as the daylight lit the room and the darkness faded before I slid back into my body below to wake. I sat up as my dream was vivid, and before I said a word to my friend, who was stirred by my abruptness, said that she had a terrible dream a few nights back and she knew that I had seen it too. My friend spoke about a man who peered out of our closet and was gone when she went to check it out. I was baffled by this entire experience, but I have never had sleep paralysis like this before or after. And a mutual friend of ours had claimed to see the same man growing up in that house before we even mentioned our story while we were camping. I know it seems crazy, but I am convinced that the house, the extension, is built somewhere it shouldn't have been. The creature was not just a physical energy. It was full of dread and malice, and it was looming off of it as it stood near me. I just know that it did not want me to be there. It's been many years since I've been back to that house, and I don't talk to that friend as much anymore. I can only wonder if it ever came back. I never noticed the extra door before. I had lived in the house for nearly 2 years, walked the same hallway every morning, passed the same walls, the same corners. But one night, as I was heading to bed, something felt off. The hallway seemed longer. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe it was the way the shadows stretched under the dim light. But then I saw it. A door. A simple wooden door at the end of the hall, where nothing had been before. I stopped. My breath caught in my throat. My fingers brushed the cold brass handle. The wood felt old, rough beneath my touch. I turned the knob. It opened easily, without resistance. Beyond it was a room, a small, dusty bedroom. A single bed sat in the center, covered in a thin white sheet. A wooden rocking chair rested near the corner, facing the wall. And along the far side, a single window let in a sliver of moonlight. I had never seen this room before. Shouldn't have been there. I barely slept that night. My mind raced with possibilities. Had I simply never noticed the door? Had it always been there? Forgotten? The next morning, I went back. The door was gone. I ran my hands along the wall, knocking against it, searching for any sign of its existence. But it was just drywall, solid, blank, no handle, no frame, no door. I felt sick. Maybe I had been dreaming. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Then, that night, I heard the rocking chair, a slow, rhythmic creaking, coming from inside the wall. I didn't sleep. I sat in my bed, heart hammering in my chest, listening to the faint creak, creak, creak. Something was in there. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the sound stopped. Then, from the other side of the wall, a knock. 3 sharp knocks. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Another knock, harder this time. Then a whisper, "Let me out." The wall shuddered, the drywall groaning like it was about to split open. I bolted out of bed, grabbed my keys, and ran. I never went back, but the house didn't let me go so easily. I stayed with a friend across town. I didn't tell them what happened. How could I? It sounded insane, but I barely slept, haunted by the thought of that room, that whisper. Then, on the 3rd night, my phone buzzed at 3:12 a.m. A notification. Missed call from unknown number. My stomach twisted. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. Then the voicemail came through. A crackling hiss, distorted, layered under thick static. But beneath it, I could hear something. A creaking sound, like a rocking chair. Then a whisper. "You can't ignore me." I threw my phone across the room. I tried to move on, to forget. I even drove by the house one last time, just to convince myself it was all in my head. But as I passed, I saw it. The door was back, and through the window, just beyond the glass, the rocking chair was moving. Someone was sitting in it, watching, waiting, smiling. One of my favorite hobbies is exploring abandoned buildings, and over the years, I've come across some pretty strange sights. But one particular experience still unsettles me. A few years ago, I stumbled upon an old, forgotten water refinery with the help of online exploration communities and Google Earth. I know it's a little reckless, but I always explore new places alone. I think part of it is for the thrill, and part of it is because if something were to go wrong, I'd feel terrible bringing someone else into a potentially dangerous situation. So, the day after my classes ended, I packed up my camera and water bottle and set off, following my hand-drawn map. After about an hour or 2 of biking, I finally reached the site, which had an old bike path leading right up to it. The area was completely overgrown with vegetation, trees growing through and around the buildings. The structures themselves were crumbling, with paint peeling off the walls and ceilings. I spent a few hours exploring the place, checking out every corner for anything interesting. I found a ton of broken windows, strange broken spheres, and even a massive old oven. After a couple of hours of successful exploration, I was ready to leave, feeling satisfied with the SD card full of photos. As I pulled my bike back through the hole in the fence where I'd entered, I suddenly remembered one last shot I wanted to take. I'm pretty particular about getting the shots I want, and I wasn't sure if I'd be back anytime soon. So, I decided to tough it out and bike back for the shot. As I rode back down the bike trail, I saw a lone man dressed in old, worn clothes walking away from the dead-end point. It struck me as odd, and something told me I shouldn't let him see me go back into the building. I rode past him, giving a brief nod, and figured I'd reach the end of the trail, turn around, and by the time I got back, he'd be gone, having continued in the opposite direction. I took my time, not rushing. When I reached the end and turned around, I was startled to see him there again, staring directly at me and walking back toward the dead end. He had a strange smile on his face, one that didn't make me feel at ease. It looked like he was holding back laughter, like he had just heard a dirty joke he was trying not to burst out laughing at. At that moment, I realized I was trapped between him and a dead end. I tried to stay calm, but I was prepared to bolt if things took a bad turn. As I got closer, I could see his face more clearly, and he looked like someone I definitely didn't want to be anywhere near. I silently cursed myself for going back for that one picture. As I got about 20 feet away from him, he suddenly called out, "I sure would like a ride. It's so hot out. Mind if I jump on?" That's when I knew this was no longer just my imagination running wild. My heart started racing, and I picked up speed, riding past him as quickly as I could. I looked behind me and saw that he had turned around and was following me. At that point, I didn't think twice. I bolted toward the road. I stopped at a gas station on my way home to grab a Gatorade. While I was there, I spotted a cop and told him I had just ridden down the old bike path by the park. He looked at me, confused, and asked why anyone would ride out there. He then told me he didn't recommend anyone go there alone, especially not at night. My husband and I used to live in a small two-story house with two main entrances, one at the front and the other on the side, which opened into the laundry room. When we were too busy or it was too late to walk our dog, we would hook his collar onto a long line attached to one of the pipes on the corner of our house, so he could go to the bathroom. We used to let him out from the laundry room door, but after noticing the large step to the ground was hard on his hips, we started letting him out through the front door since the porch was closer to the ground. One night, I was home alone with my dog. It was around midnight, and I decided to let him out one last time before bed. I hooked him up to the line, closed the door, locked it, and then headed into the kitchen to put away the dishes. This was pretty routine. Even if he used the bathroom quickly, he liked to walk around the front yard for a few minutes before coming back inside. As I was putting away the dishes, I heard a scratch at the door. That's what my dog does when he wants to come in. So I walked over to open it. Since I've watched too many scary movies, I always look through the peephole before opening the door. I did my usual check to see my dog at the door, but instead, I saw a man staring intently at the door handle. I froze, hands still on the door handle. I don't know how much time passed, but then I heard another scratch, louder this time. This snapped me out of my shock. I quickly grabbed my phone and called my husband to tell him what was happening. He was confused, and I probably wasn't explaining things well, but he said he was heading home. It was then that I realized my dog was still outside with this man. I returned to the front door, trying to make as little noise as possible to check if the stranger was still there. Sure enough, he was standing there, head down, still staring at the doorknob. I tiptoed to the laundry room and quietly opened the door. I couldn't see my dog anywhere, and the side of the house was covered in gravel. I knew stepping outside would make a lot of noise, so with my heart pounding, I stayed by the front door, keeping an eye on the man. I considered calling the police, but I didn't think they would take me seriously since he was just standing there. I tried to take a picture of him with my phone, but my camera wouldn't capture anything behind the glass. Suddenly, the man looked up directly at me. It was like he knew I was there. He glared at me and then flashed a taunting, malicious grin. He stood like that for a few seconds before turning around and walking down the street. I stayed where I was, almost expecting him to rush back and start pounding on the door. Thankfully, my husband arrived shortly after. He convinced me to call the police, and we went out to search for our dog. We found out that the man had cut the end of the line attached to the pipe, and our dog had decided to wander into our neighbor's backyard, where we found him. It's been 3 years since that night. We've moved to a new house, and the police were never able to identify any suspects. Since then, we always make sure to take our dog on long walks before the sun goes down. A few years ago, I was living in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, managing a somewhat legally gray consumer credit business, when I decided it was time to take a well-earned break and escape to a small town nearby. The town I chose was a highly popular tourist spot, known for its stunning location by a river nestled in a deep valley, filled with ancient churches. With many options for accommodations available, I opted not to book ahead and instead wandered around to find something that suited me. Eventually, I came across a charming guest house perched on a hill with about an acre of land. Upon arriving, I was warmly welcomed by an elderly woman, true to Georgian hospitality, and her son, who appeared to be in his early 30s. After a quick introduction, the son returned to his work of filling a large hole that he mentioned was for a septic tank, which gave off a rather unpleasant odor. As is typical in Georgia, the hostess immediately offered me tea, homemade wine, bread, and cheese, all of which were incredibly satisfying. Though I'm American, my family hails from Eastern Europe, so I speak Russian, as many Georgians do, which allowed us to have an in-depth conversation. We moved from casual introductions to more personal questions, like whether I had a partner or who I was dating, which, surprisingly, is a frequent topic when sweet grandmothers are involved and eager to introduce you to their granddaughters. At the time, I was dating a fellow expat from Western Europe. When I mentioned that I had a girlfriend, the hostess was overjoyed and eagerly asked to see a photo. She took a look at the picture, smiled approvingly, and made a comment about her physique that, if it weren't coming from a sweet old grandmother, might have seemed inappropriate. Then she pressed me, asking why I didn't invite her along, claiming that no good boyfriend would leave his girlfriend behind. Feeling a little cornered, I lied and said she was busy with work, which wasn't true, but that she would be joining us later in the evening. The hostess was thrilled by this news and quickly called her son over, asking me to show him the picture of my girlfriend. Early in our conversation, I had mentioned that I didn't speak Georgian. The son looked at the photo, nodded approvingly, and spoke briefly to his mother in Georgian before turning to me with a wide smile and giving me a thumbs up. "Very pretty," he said in English. "You lucky brother." Then, in Russian, he asked if I had texted her to invite her. I lied again, saying I had sent her a message and reaffirmed that she would be arriving soon. It was around 4 p.m., with the golden hour light casting a warm glow over the surrounding mountains and valley. The son then asked if I liked cha-cha. Cha-cha, Georgia's national liquor, is a potent drink with an alcohol content ranging from 30 to 75%, made from distilled grapes. By then, I had become quite the expert in drinking it. Despite feeling a bit uneasy about their odd focus on my female companion, I agreed. Cha-cha is definitely not for the faint of heart, but by then I was well accustomed to it. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to how deliberately the shots were poured, but I pushed my concerns aside and took the shot after a traditional toast. About 20 minutes later, I started feeling unwell and fatigued, so I excused myself to my room, telling the hostess I needed a short nap. This story is a collection of events that occurred in a house where I lived for 10 years with my younger brother, G, and our parents. I'm the older sibling with a 7-year gap between G and me. When I was 9 and G was just 2, my dad had to travel abroad for work, and he would be gone for an entire year. So it was just the 3 of us, Mom, G, and me at home. Mom didn't like being alone, so G and I often slept in her room with her. She's a bit of a scaredy cat, and having us there made her feel safer. Plus, it gave me a chance to watch TV, which she always kept on for comfort. She preferred the light over the dark, which made it hard for her to fall asleep if the room was too dark. Back then, we didn't have Netflix, and the internet wasn't as widespread, so we had to plan our movie nights around TV schedules. On this particular night, around 9 p.m., we were all gathered in Mom's room, ready to watch a movie. At the time, G was just 2, still figuring out crawling. The bed was ready, and we were about to get under the covers when we noticed something missing. Potato chips and Doritos. How could we have a movie night without them? So, Mom and I decided to race to the kitchen to grab some snacks. For context, let me briefly describe the layout of the house. It wasn't huge, but it was long and narrow. The house measured about 30 feet in width and nearly 200 feet in length, with surrounding walls, and though it was 10 feet above street level, the surrounding houses were taller. When you went up the stairs and opened the front door, you entered the living room, which also served as the dining room. This room had 2 doors, one on the far left and one on the far right. The door on the right led to an outside corridor that passed by windows of various rooms, including the window of my parents' room, which was at the far end. The door on the left opened to an inside corridor. Down this corridor, there were 3 doors on the right: my room, my brother's room, and the bathroom. The fourth door was at the end of the corridor, leading to Mom's room, which was directly across from the kitchen entrance. The layout was pretty straightforward, with a clear path from Mom's room to the kitchen. So back to the story. Mom and I dashed to the kitchen, leaving G lying in the middle of the bed. We knew exactly where the snacks were, and in under 30 seconds we had what we needed. But when we returned to the room, something strange happened. G was still in the same spot, not having moved at all, but he was laughing for no reason. It would have been adorable, but there was something else. The bed covers weren't just untucked. They were folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Mom and I exchanged confused looks, trying to make sense of it. The only explanation we could come up with was that the bed must have been like that when we left, and we just didn't notice. To be sure, we checked under the bed and inside the closet, but nothing seemed out of place. After locking the door, we settled in, enjoyed our movie, and eventually fell asleep with the TV still on. Nothing else unusual happened that night. Fast forward 4 years, and I'm now 13. Dad's back from his trip, and we're all hanging out in my parents' room, waiting for Mom to finish putting on her earrings before we head to the amusement park. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a loud banging sound followed by a terrible screeching noise pierced the air. It came from the small, external but still inside area just outside the kitchen. We all rushed to check it out, even though it was around 9 a.m. and the blazing hot sun made it feel like any other ordinary morning. Plus, with Dad home, there was a reassuring sense of safety. As we opened the kitchen door that led to the outside area, we found ourselves face to face with a washing machine gone wild. The banging was the washing machine working, and the screeching was it scraping across the floor as it shook violently. Clearly, it wasn't working like it was supposed to. My dad laughed and asked Mom if she had forgotten to program it properly. Mom seemed a little freaked out and said she hadn't. Dad was doubtful, so he tried to turn it off. He figured it was probably the timer, so he twisted the dial to set it right. And sure enough, it stopped. We all laughed, feeling silly for jumping to conclusions about something supernatural. Dad looked smug, like he'd just solved the mystery. But that feeling didn't last long. As we were about to head back inside, the machine roared back to life. This time, it was shaking and banging so violently that it actually started jumping around. Dad immediately went to adjust the timer again, but nothing happened. He tried the off button, but it was unresponsive. He even opened the lid, expecting it to stop spinning, but still no luck. The machine didn't stop until Mom yanked the plug out of the wall while Dad and I tried to hold it in place. This time, no one was laughing. Instead, we just stood there, staring at the machine, waiting for it to start again, even though it was unplugged. After a minute or so of silence, we snapped out of what felt like a trance and went on with our day. 3 years later, I was 16 and G was 9. It was around 11 a.m. when Mom asked if we wanted to join her for a trip to the supermarket. G declined and I followed suit, more interested in what I was doing on the computer. The supermarket was just a few houses down, so if Mom needed help carrying groceries, she'd usually call me, and I'd run to help her out. Mom always said she was just grabbing a few things, but she'd come back with enough for an army. So while I was browsing the internet and listening to G getting frustrated over his PS2 game in his room, I heard it, the sound of someone at the gate. I could clearly hear someone messing with the padlock, so I assumed it was just Mom returning from the store. My brother must have heard the sound too because he paused his game and sprinted past my door. A little irritated, I realized I needed to help Mom with whatever groceries she was bringing in. I stood up and headed for the front door. By the time I reached it, G had already gotten there first. But something didn't feel right, and that's when I felt that chilling sensation crawl up my spine. I saw Mom struggling with the padlock outside the gate, but G was on the other side with her, locked out. Had he gone outside to meet her and locked the gate behind him? I wondered. So I asked, when did G leave the house? The answer I got made my head spin. Mom told me that G had changed his mind at the last minute as she was leaving and had been with her this whole time. I had lived in that house for 10 years, and during that time it was normal to hear my name being called out. The sensation of not being alone in a room, especially in the hallway once the light was turned off, was something I couldn't shake. You couldn't see the light fading towards the room at the end. Instead, the darkness would creep out of that room and consume the light. and it always felt like someone was staring at you. I don't know why, but even after I saw what looked like a child running through the house, the image that stuck with me of whatever presence was there was that of a woman with long black hair, dressed in white. I can't explain why. Maybe I associated it with a movie or a story I had heard, but every time I looked down that hallway, it always felt like a woman was watching me. This brings me to my final experience. Now I'm 26, living in a different country. After a regular day, I was ready for bed, turned on a cooking show on the TV, set the sleep timer, and drifted off. When I woke up, I felt this deep unease in my stomach, like something wasn't right. The only light in the room was from the TV. I was drowsy and couldn't move. I scanned the room with my eyes and realized my parents were asleep on a bed next to me. Wait, this isn't my room. I was back in that house, the one we had left years ago. As I wondered how this could be, that's when I saw her, the woman standing by the door. Her black hair covered most of her face, and she was wearing what looked like a white nightgown. Though I could barely see her eyes, I could feel that she was staring at me. Completely unable to move and feeling drugged, I looked over at my parents still sleeping, and I saw the woman's attention shift towards them. But now, I felt anger radiating from her towards them. In that moment, I thought I would cry, shake, or lose my voice, but the thought was quickly replaced by an overwhelming, thick rage. The woman seemed startled when I suddenly started cursing at her, especially since I had been unable to speak moments before. Even more surprised when I managed to get to my feet. With all the rage building inside me, I thought, sleep paralysis, right? I'm the only one allowed in my head. She blocked the door with her body, but I pushed her aside. The second we made contact, the rage instantly vanished. Everything else disappeared, leaving only one feeling, an endless, suffocating loneliness. The woman slammed against the wall, and I ran down the corridor. When I reached the door at the end, I opened it and woke up in my own room. The TV was off. Daylight was streaming in through the thin curtains. I'm not the kind of person who has vivid dreams, so this one stuck with me. I've been reflecting on it for weeks now. It happened during my freshman year of college, when I was back in my hometown for Thanksgiving break. I come from a small town in New England, the kind of place that makes you long to leave because there's nothing ever exciting happening. I guess this was the town's way of reminding me to appreciate it. It was late on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. I was at a friend's house, catching up with my high school friends now that we were all back for the holiday. That night, a thick fog rolled in, the kind that's typical of New England, with a mix of cold air and humidity. As I was driving home, I passed the town library, which is situated next to a small duck pond. The fog was even thicker over the water, casting an eerie golden light from the surrounding lampposts. As a film student, I always carried my camera with me, and without thinking, I turned my car around and parked in the library lot, which overlooked the pond. I thought about walking down to the water, but something told me not to. It wasn't fear, at least not yet. At that moment, I didn't feel scared at all, just excited and in awe of the scene before me. Still, I decided not to leave the safety of my car, and that choice probably kept me safe. I left the car running with the headlights on, rolled down the window, and stuck my arm out to take a few photos of the pond and the mist. When I pulled my arm back in and looked at the photos, I realized they were awful due to my poor technique. That's when I first felt like something wasn't right. It's hard to explain, but I had the same feeling I often get in nightmares where I'm stranded in open water. I know there are sharks swimming beneath me, unseen but felt. That feeling was washing over me as I scrolled through the photos, a sense of impending danger that I couldn't shake. I looked up from my camera, now on high alert, and glanced around, but saw nothing at first. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness, coming toward the light of my headlights. It was a man. He wore dark jeans and a black zip-up jacket, his hair short and dark. I can't remember his face. What I do remember is that he was walking toward the library, toward my car. I waited, trying to keep my fear in check. Maybe he wasn't heading my way. Maybe he was just walking to the road. But he kept coming closer, his pace quickening as he neared. I remembered my window was down and hurriedly rolled it up. He was now standing directly in front of my car's hood, and I knew with absolute certainty. He was staring straight at me. The look in his eyes, his face was expressionless, but his eyes were intent, determined. The moment we made eye contact, the moment I saw that look, I just reacted. I don't remember feeling fear or panic, just being more alert than I have ever been. I never took my eyes off of the man as I threw my car into reverse and spun out of the parking spot I was in. But I went the wrong way. Instead of turning my car towards the exit, I turned toward the back parking lot. Yes, there was another exit I could get to, but I would have to drive around the entire library to get there. Either that or reverse all the way out onto the road and risk hitting something, a tree, another car. I didn't want to risk crashing. Then I'd have no escape. I decided I would have to go around the library. It would take longer, but it was the safest option. All these thoughts went through my head in an instant. The man ran to get in front of my car. One of my biggest regrets in life is not running him over then and there. I put my car in drive and waited. He stopped running once he was in front of the car and then took his time. He walked slowly around the hood of my car, staring at me the whole time. Our eyes followed each other. He smiled. The moment he was clear of the front of my car, two things happened. He lunged for my car door. I floored it. I remember the sight of my car sailing past his outstretched hand. I drove as fast as I've ever driven, taking the corners at speed around the library. As I came out the other side, the exit was in sight, but the man wasn't. I drove as fast as I could toward the exit. As I got in front of the library again, I looked over and saw the man running as fast as he could to get to my car. I sped out of the library parking lot and onto the main road. The police station was a block away, and I made a beeline for it, still driving recklessly fast, hoping to be pulled over by a cop. I got to the police station, and that's when the fear finally settled in. I sat in my car and cried, breathing raggedly, completely frozen. I couldn't get out of my car. I was terrified that the man had followed me there, that as soon as I got out of the car, he would get me. A police officer came out to my car and escorted me inside. They must have seen me on their security cameras. I spoke with a female sergeant. I told her what happened, gave her the best description I could. They immediately sent cars out, but found no one. I assumed that the man was after my car, my camera maybe, and said that out loud. The female sergeant looked at me and shook her head. What she told me I'll never forget. I don't think he was after your car or your camera. He was after you. My name's Rory, and I work as a security guard here in Scotland. The company I work for mostly handles nightclubs and construction site security, but for some reason I always seem to get the weirder jobs. It works for me, though, since they're usually during the day, and I'm just not cut out for night shifts anymore. Anyway, one day, my boss asked if I wanted to work a Saturday shift over at the Mercure Hotel in Livingston. He told me it would be a solid 10-hour shift, providing security for a convention they were hosting. It sounded like easy money, so I asked him what kind of convention needed security, and all he knew was that it was called ScotiaCon. No hints from the name, so I was curious about what the whole thing was about. It turned out it was a big meetup for people called furries. What I'm about to tell you is all learned on the fly, so don't hold me to it. But furries are basically people who identify as animals, so they dress up in elaborate suits and do their thing, including some dancing around. Don't get me wrong, they were all really friendly, but the whole thing was definitely unusual. They were selling all sorts of artwork and clothes they had made, some of which seemed a bit inappropriate, but there were no kids around, so no harm done. Like I said, really nice people overall. But there was one person who stood out as an exception. There were a few hundred people there, many of them younger, and it was far from what I expected when I heard the word convention. They didn't seem too strange or anything. There was just a lot of them, which was part of the reason I was there. I didn't really see anything unusual happening. But when I got the call that the security team was needed in the main convention hall, I was honestly a bit shocked. So I am following this other guy that I had not worked with before down a corridor and into the main hall, and immediately you can see where the trouble is. Everyone is looking over into one particular corner where you can hear this argument going on. My colleagues and I make our way through the crowds of oddly dressed but well-meaning folk until we came across the culprits. Most of the noise was coming from one guy with a dog collar on. He had ears on, all sorts of dog-themed stuff on his backpack and clothing. Basically, dogs were the kids' thing. I start asking what the big song and dance is about, and he told me he had been arguing with the stall owner over the price of a piece of artwork. But the guy that owns the stall just wants him out, says he's been threatening him, all this other stuff. All I do is try and separate them. I can't really be throwing people out, but this guy's causing trouble, so I start trying to move him away. First, the dog boy seems like he's just going to walk away. But suddenly, he doubles back and throws a kick at the guy's stall. Not just that, but he seriously starts barking at this guy like really loud. Rough, 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 rough. It was intense, man. Naturally, I then go to grip him, and the kid actually bites me. I went to throw an arm around his neck to get control over him, but he just caught my arm and sank his teeth into it. Now, luckily, I'm wearing my branded security jacket, and the fabric is just tough and plasticky enough to have this guy's jaw grip slip off the meat of my arm. But man, if he had gotten a grip on me, I might have had a chunk bitten off. The guy was near rabid. As the other security guys are dragging him off, I can see him trying to bite him, but I can hear this noise too. And it actually took a second for the penny to drop, that it was the sound of his teeth clapping together like this sharp snap snap sound. Honestly, it was really scary. I get my arm looked at by the medics. Police turn up and take the guy away. Definitely the most eventful thing that happened. The rest of it was kind of boring after the initial furry shock. Nice people though. I wouldn't mind going back. One of the houses I grew up in had a balcony that connected both my mother's bedroom and mine through large glass doors. Next to the balcony were two trees, one of which I used to climb up and down from the balcony. One night, when I was 13 years old, my brother and mother weren't home. I was lying in bed, reading with a dim reading light. Suddenly, I heard something rustling in one of the trees outside. It didn't alarm me at first since possums and bats were common in our area. My room had thin curtains on the glass doors leading to the balcony, and the doors faced the street, where streetlight always shone through the curtains. After hearing the rustling, I noticed a shadow slowly moving past the doors. I instantly turned off my reading light and froze, feeling like a deer in headlights. The shadow was tall, so it wasn't the neighbor kid, and definitely not my mother, who was only 5 feet tall. The figure moved slowly, as though trying not to be seen. Although they likely couldn't see into my room, I could see them thanks to the streetlight behind them. The figure moved past my doors and out of sight. I sat frozen, unable to think or move, unsure of what to do, until I heard another sound. The sound of someone trying to open one of the glass doors, my mother's doors to the balcony. I wasn't sure if she had locked them, but I wasn't going to take chances. I quickly and silently moved to my bedroom door and locked it. I listened carefully, and I could still hear the person jiggling the glass door handle. It sounded like the door wouldn't open. I felt a slight relief they couldn't get in. I thought that once they realized the door wouldn't open, they'd leave, right? But then I heard light footsteps coming back along the balcony, stopping right in front of my glass doors. I froze again. They couldn't see me, and I couldn't let them know I could see them. I watched as a shadowy hand reached for my door handle. My heart stopped. Had I locked the doors earlier? I'd been outside earlier that day. What if I'd forgotten? The seconds before the person grabbed the handle felt like an eternity. Thankfully, when they tried to open the door, it didn't budge. It was locked. I breathed a massive sigh of relief, praying they hadn't heard it click. The figure then started pacing back and forth along the balcony. I didn't have a cell phone, and the landline was at the other end of the house, but I couldn't take my eyes off the person. I was silently crying, praying they'd just leave. Then I heard him stop, and he said, "I could just break the glass, you know?" Before I could even process that, I saw headlights turn around the corner and stop at our property gate. My mom was home, the figure on the balcony moved out of sight. When my mom came inside, I was hysterical and barely coherent in telling her what had happened. Eventually, I got the message across, and she called the police. They never found or caught anyone, but a neighbor reported seeing a truck in the street that matched the description of a vehicle recently connected to attempted child abductions near my school, which was just a block away. Monroe County, West Virginia, can truly be described as being in the middle of nowhere. Situated in the southernmost part of the state, it is one of the most remote and rural areas in the entire eastern United States. The county lacks even a single stoplight or fast food restaurant and boasts one of the lowest population densities in the country. Like many rural areas in the east, Monroe struggles with issues like opiate addiction and the related crimes. However, cases of disappearance or murder are incredibly rare. When such an event does occur, it catches the attention of both locals and law enforcement. So when, in April of 2007, a dark red Chevy pickup truck was discovered abandoned behind an old, dilapidated building in Peterstown, it caused a great deal of alarm in the small community. This truck belonged to Timothy Wayne Dalton, a man who had been missing for nearly 3 weeks. Timothy's missing persons profile described him as weighing just over 200 pounds, with dark brown hair and pale blue eyes. He was last seen wearing a dark blue button-up shirt, light gray shorts, and black Nike sneakers. He often wore a dog tag necklace, a keepsake from a relative's military service, and usually carried a pocket knife. Those close to him noted that while he sometimes went without shaving for up to a week, he never grew significant facial hair and had a slight stutter when he spoke. In the days leading up to the discovery of the truck, sheriff's deputies had pieced together some details about Timothy's life. He had visited his mother on March 26th, and during their time together, he seemed completely normal. They spoke briefly about his job cutting firewood, which, while modest, made his mother proud, especially considering the poor state of the economy. However, Timothy's mother did observe that he was acting a bit nervous, glancing out the window every so often as though watching for someone or something. Although it was not uncommon for a son to be protective of his mother, she didn't think much of his unusual behavior at the time. That would turn out to be the last time Timothy was seen alive. The truck, which was found about a week and a half later, became the only clue to his whereabouts. Despite his mother's growing concerns, local law enforcement initially claimed there was no foul play involved in his disappearance. However, reports from credible sources indicated that when the truck was located, the driver's side window had been shattered from the outside, with glass scattered inside the vehicle. Despite this, police insisted there was no evidence of a struggle and suggested the window could have been broken either before or after Timothy's disappearance. Interviews with Timothy's family made it clear that it was completely out of character for him to leave without notifying anyone. And while it was a well-known fact that Timothy had dabbled in some non-violent crime in the past, he had no outstanding warrants and was not a suspect in any recent burglary case. He had been described by many as a timid fellow with a heart of gold. And as far as his friends know, he was not involved in the narcotics trade either as a dealer or a user. This essentially eliminated the possibility that he had skipped town out of fear of being arrested for something. A theory that was compounded by the fact that pretty much all of his meager belongings could still be found at his place of residence. As it stands, there are two prevailing theories that attempt to explain Timothy's disappearance. The first is that, for whatever reason, he owed money to a 1%er motorcycle gang that sometimes passed through the area. This theory came about due to the fact that at the time he vanished, Timothy's sister was dating a Hells Angel who was patched to a Princeton chapter of the gang, a town just a half hour away from Peterstown. As a frequent drug user, she was careless with her finances, and it's very possible that the Angels passed along whatever debt she owed to her blood relatives. Then, when Timothy couldn't pay up, the Angels decided to make an example out of him. The second theory revolves around a rumor that Timothy had bad blood with a local deputy who was supposedly violent, unstable, and corrupt. It was common knowledge among members of the Peterstown community that one particular area police officer believed he was above the law. This same officer happened to give Timothy a ticket during a traffic stop one day. One that Timothy insisted was unfairly cited. He swore he'd see the cop in court. Then, to the surprise of the local townsfolk, he did and ended up actually winning the case. He was awarded sizable compensation, and the cop in question was disciplined for his apparent misconduct. It was a humiliation, one the officer couldn't ever get over. And as much as this particular cop was an embarrassment to the force, there's every chance that a bunch of good old boy deputies would close ranks around him should he have decided to take a little revenge. This would most definitely explain how the reports of a broken window suddenly morphed into a conclusion of no signs of a struggle. Yet these two theories, as elaborate as they may seem, are still little more than conjecture. So the question remains, what could have happened to Timothy Dalton? It certainly wouldn't have been easy for him to leave Monroe County without his truck, as it truly is in the middle of nowhere with no local taxi companies in the area or bus routes running through it. The only explanation is that someone picked him up, conscious or unconscious, dead or alive, and took him out of Monroe. Peterstown has a population of just less than 700. People talk, people see things, but apparently, nobody saw hide nor hair of Timothy after he had visited his mother's place. The woods around the town might be dark and deep, but they're actually commonly frequented by local hunters who often scour the backwoods for fresh meat to put on the table to save a few dollars on the grocery bill. Surely, if Timothy was murdered and dumped in the woods, a hunter or perhaps a hunting dog would have come across his remains at some point. As far as I can tell, it really is as if the guy just disappeared, dropped off the face of the earth one day for some unknown reason. But maybe it's the case that whoever did disappear Timothy knew a little too much about the process of searching and finding someone. Maybe it was a person who had experience in finding bodies, who for professional reasons would know the most effective method of making someone just up and vanish without leaving so much as a trace of them behind. But whoever that might be is still completely up for debate. Yet perhaps it might be better if we avoid any kind of heavy speculation. Lest we offend the wrong person, a person who might just be violent, unstable, and corrupt. This happened about a year or two ago. I was living in Southern California, in the San Diego area with my family, including my older sister. Let's call her Eliza. We had a cousin visiting from out of the country, who we'll call Jerry. He and my sister are really close because they're about the same age, so Eliza decided to take it upon herself to be his tour guide since it had been years since he'd been to California. He was just a little kid the last time he came. Eliza and Jerry are both huge fans of pop culture, especially pop music. At the time, there was a fairly famous pop singer performing in Los Angeles, which is a bit of a drive from where we live. Eliza is especially into this artist, so she bought tickets for her and Jerry to go to the show during his visit. At first, I was a little salty because I wasn't included, especially since I'm also a fan of the artist, even if not as much as they were. But whatever, I didn't want to miss out on the day trip, so I invited two of my close friends, Savannah and Eric, who were sort of a couple at the time. I don't have my license, but they both do, so I figured once Jerry and Eliza went to the show, we could drive around and do whatever we wanted. My sister drove all 5 of us to Los Angeles, her and Jerry in the front and Savannah, Eric, and me in the back. Even though I'm only a casual fan of the artist they were going to see, Eliza and Jerry played the artist's music on repeat the entire drive. With traffic, it turned into a 3-hour trip. Mind you, the artist only had about 3 albums out at the time, and one of them was pretty loud and a bit depressing. Savannah, Eric, and I are more into softer, rock-type music, so you can imagine how quickly we got tired of hearing the same songs over and over. To make matters worse, both Eliza and Jerry felt the need to scream the lyrics the entire time, and unfortunately, neither of them has the most pleasant voice. By the time we got to Los Angeles around noon, we were all starving and in desperate need of a bathroom. But in LA, finding a clean, available restroom is always a struggle. I suspect it's because of the homeless population, which means many places are closed to the public or you need to buy something to use their restrooms. On top of that, trying to agree on where to eat added to the stress. Jerry had never tried ramen before, since traditional Japanese food isn't common where he lives, so we tried to find somewhere that worked for all of us. However, Eliza is strictly gluten-free due to health issues, and Savannah has a severe peanut allergy. So finding a place that could accommodate everyone was a bit of a challenge. These details aren't crucial to the story, but I want to give you a sense of the chain of events that shaped my mood and later actions. Eliza and Jerry were in their own world, probably getting hyped up for the show later that night. Eliza kept ignoring anything my friends and I wanted to do while we were in LA, and she definitely pulled the "I'm older, so I make the rules" card with me. By this point, I was already getting pretty sick of being around both of them and couldn't wait to drop them off at the show so my friends and I could hang out, just the three of us. Once we finally dropped them off, the rest of the night was great, just like it always is when it's just me, Savannah, and Eric hanging out. We went to Santa Monica and watched the sunset, walked around a bit, and by the time we started getting hungry, we checked out Yelp and found a burger place that looked amazing and was well suited for our tight budget. I don't go to LA often, so when we pulled up the directions and got there, I wasn't aware of which park we exactly were in. We were looking to park, but a group of what seemed to be gang members stood in front of the spot we were going to park and started approaching the car and putting their hands on the exterior while looking into the window. Eric was driving and said something to the effect of, "You guys fine with parking here?" "Not fine with parking there." Both Eliza and I told him we needed to pack it up and find somewhere else. I have always been extra cautious, especially in LA, since I've had a few other unsavory experiences, including the time a man followed me and my friend into our car and we had to shove him out. So there was no way I felt good about parking there. So we drove a few blocks, starving and ready to just forget it, until we found a clear spot in a well-populated area. The food was great and all was well, aside from the bunches of homeless people I saw around me. Pretty common in any part of LA you find yourself in. I didn't even realize that we had been in the heart of Skid Row. Once we made our way over, though, we discovered that the place we wanted to eat was in the midst of Skid Row. For those who don't know, Skid Row is a neighborhood in downtown Los Angeles that extends about 50 city blocks and is mostly home to the homeless. There are also a lot of dealers and ladies of the night that hang around there too. We were walking back to our car and I looked up to one of the taller buildings along the block, and the sign at the side of the top of the building read, "Hotel Cecil, low weekly rates, 700 rooms." The Cecil Hotel could be a post in and of itself, but in short, it's an old hotel that briefly was in its prime back in the 20s, 30s. But as the Depression struck, the hotel and its ambience went down with it. It had been known for housing some of society's unsavory, such as the homeless and those in the drug and sex industry, along with a few infamous guests such as the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. It's supposed to be vacant as of now, but as far as I could see, I'm pretty sure there was ongoing activity within the building and around it. Squatters, I'm assuming. I don't believe in the paranormal or anything like that, but I can definitely confirm the unanimous thought that the place gives off really sketchy, creepy vibes. Once I realized that's where we were, my friends and I booked it to the car. On the other side of the street, we saw people looking into another parked car, and they looked our way once we approached the area. But thankfully, we took off in time. Thankfully, nothing happened to us there, but naturally, I was on edge a bit after that. We stopped to pick up some pie from a pie shop Eric was obsessed with, since it was on our way to the venue Eliza and Jerry were at. We thought we had plenty of time, but by the time we got to eating, Eliza called me and demanded we come over immediately. I knew nothing was wrong, so I did hurry a bit, but we decided to finish our pies before heading off. Eliza kept texting me with impatience, saying things like, "Waiting here is boring, and where are you? We're tired. We want to go now." Typical bossy older sister things. She was kind of a jerk to me the entire day, so I guess I used that to justify my jerkiness back. But then we had another bump in the road. The pie Savannah tried had peanuts cooked into the crust, and she got so sick. We rushed out of there and tried to stop somewhere for water and an antihistamine since she didn't have her EpiPen. She started feeling a bit better, but she was still really sick, and I was really stressed and worried. Once we got to the venue, Eliza and Jerry took forever to come out. I guess they started waiting to see if they could meet the artist as she came out. Once they finally came in and Eric and I shuffled to the back seat, Eliza had the nerve to yell at me for taking so long. We had to stop a few times so Savannah could throw up and rehydrate too. On top of that, Eliza and Jerry continued to play the same artist on repeat again, along with their choppy videos of the show. Oh, and of course they were singing. With Savannah sick, Eric as aloof as ever, and me stressing and on edge about everything that had happened thus far, I was ready to bang my head against the window. I know in the scheme of things, these aren't big deals. But by the time they all added up, especially my sick friend and the bad attitude of my sister, it drove me up the wall. We dropped Eric and Savannah off first since their town was on the way before ours. It was around 1 a.m. At that point, I was sick and tired of the music and loud talking and cackling and just overall annoying conversations of my sister and cousin. I was that level of mad where you're quiet angry. So once the two left, I got out of the car and demanded that I drive home the rest of the way. Mostly so I could DJ, but also so I wouldn't have to hear them be jerks to me and talk so loudly. Eliza made a fuss about it, but ultimately, due to Jerry's cooperation, went to the back seat. Once again, I am up the wall, very on edge from this. I play my music as I drive us home and everything seems fine. It's when I'm almost home that something happens. Our house is off the major freeway in town, though it's a bit of a lonely, desolate area. To get to our place, you have to pass a hilltop with other houses on it and make a turn around it to get to our neighborhood. There's a cemented patch of grass between a stretch of concrete between the hill and the turn that's used as a divider between oncoming and ongoing traffic. This happened one night when I was driving around a little after 1:45 or 2 a.m. It was one of those late hours when the area isn't particularly busy, quiet and calm, you know? As I was coming up to make a turn around the hill, I looked to my left and saw something that's been on my mind ever since. On the grass divider and along the cement, there were people lined up along the thinner part of the divider with a small crowd of people standing on the grass patch. There were at least 15 of them, and they were all dressed in white. I could clearly see them with my headlights on, the brightness of their clothes standing out in the dark. They were moving around, almost as if they were dancing when I first noticed them. But then, as I drove past them, unable to take my eyes off of them, they suddenly raised their voices, all talking at once. I could hear them through the window, even over my music, and then they started sprinting towards me. They were trying to get my attention, following along as I made my turn to the right. They literally followed me, talking as they chased the car. It was one of the creepiest, most bizarre things I've ever experienced. I couldn't say for sure, but they were dressed in a way that resembled KKK members, though I can't be certain that's what they were. I was having a full-on WTF moment. I didn't understand what I saw, but I knew I saw something that didn't feel right. In a panic, I screamed and asked Eliza and Jerry if they saw it. Of course, they were both dozing off, groggily denying it. But I knew what I saw. Some of their faces weren't covered, and I clearly saw a man with a mustache. They were rushing toward us, and I had this feeling they wanted me to stop the car. I've heard of people using distractions or diversions to target drivers, so I wasn't sure what they were doing, but it felt off, dangerous, even. The town I live in is small, old, and somewhat rural, and we're known as one of the most conservative towns in the USA. Could have been something like the KKK, given how they were dressed, though I'm not sure. There are also some known practitioners of the occult in the area, though it's not as common now. Eliza and Jerry got annoyed with me because I drove around the block a few times instead of heading straight to our street. By the time I was sure they weren't following me anymore, I just couldn't shake the creepy feeling. I had to take extra precautions just to be safe. I told our mom about it, and she kind of believed me, though I think she was skeptical. Sounds so absurd, after all. But my sister still denies it to this day. She insists it never happened and even refuses to acknowledge that I was the one driving. Sometimes it makes me feel crazy, but I know without a doubt that I was the one driving. I'm 100% sure that I saw something, some mysterious group doing who knows what. So be careful, guys. When you're out of town, especially in places like Los Angeles, expect the unexpected. But what happened to me? That was just over a block away from my own house, lurking in the dark, waiting for some unsuspecting motorists to stop and engage with them. Or maybe something far more sinister than just talking. They say no good deed goes unpunished, and I never truly understood that phrase until I picked up a hitchhiker on a remote stretch of highway. What started as a simple act of kindness quickly turned into a nightmare that would haunt me for years. It was the third day of my cross-country road trip. I'd always dreamed of driving coast to coast, soaking in the diverse landscapes and getting a real feel for the heart of America. The open road called to me, and I answered eagerly. I had just crossed the border into Nevada, the desert stretching endlessly in front of me. The sun was setting, casting the sky in fiery shades of orange and pink. It was stunning, yet I couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of loneliness that came with the vast, empty landscape. That's when I spotted him, a solitary figure by the side of the road, thumb out, his posture desperate. My first instinct was to keep going. After all, I'd heard all the cautionary tales about picking up strangers. But something about his slumped shoulders and the desolate location made me second-guess myself. I slowed down, my conscience outweighing my doubts. As I pulled over, I took a closer look. He was a man in his mid-30s, with messy brown hair and a scruffy beard. His clothes were worn and covered in dust, as if he'd been traveling for days. "Where are you headed?" I called out through the passenger window. "Anywhere but here," he replied with a weak smile. "Name's Jack. Been walking for hours." Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. "Hop in. I'm heading west. I can take you as far as the next town." Jack's face lit up with relief as he climbed into the car. "Thanks, man. You're a lifesaver." As we merged back onto the highway, I introduced myself and tried to make small talk. Jack was polite, but he kept his answers vague when it came to his situation. He mentioned something about a job falling through and needing a fresh start, but I didn't press him for more details. For the first hour, everything seemed fine. We talked about the weather, the view, and our favorite road trip snacks. But as the sky darkened and the miles piled up, I began to notice subtle changes in Jack's demeanor. He became increasingly agitated, constantly looking over his shoulder and fidgeting in his seat. His responses to my questions became shorter, almost curt. The easy rapport we had established earlier evaporated, replaced by a tension I couldn't quite explain. "You okay?" I asked, glancing over at him. "We can stop if you need a break." Jack's head snapped towards me, his eyes wild. No stops. We need to keep moving." The intensity in his voice made me grip the steering wheel tighter. Something was definitely off. "Look, man," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I think maybe this is far enough. There's a gas station coming up. I can drop you off there." That's when everything went sideways. In a flash, Jack pulled out a knife. The blade glinted in the dim light of the dashboard. My heart leaped into my throat. "Keep driving," he growled, all pretense of friendliness gone. "And don't even think about trying anything stupid." My mind raced. How had I been so naive? I should have trusted my initial instincts. Now I was trapped in a car with an armed, unstable stranger, miles from anywhere. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. "I don't have much money, but you can have it all." Jack laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "This isn't about money. I need to get away, far away, and you're my ticket out of here." As the reality of the situation sank in, I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This wasn't a simple robbery. I was being kidnapped. "Listen," I said, desperately trying to reason with him. "Whatever trouble you're in, this isn't the way to handle it. Let me help you. We can go to the police." "Shut up," Jack shouted, pressing the knife closer to my side. "Just drive. I'll tell you where to go." For the next few hours, we drove in tense silence, broken only by Jack's occasional directions. He had me turn off the main highway onto smaller, less traveled roads. With each mile, we drove deeper into the desert, farther from civilization and any hope of rescue. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out of this nightmare. Could I overpower him? Crash the car? Each option seemed more desperate and dangerous than the last. As dawn broke, painting the desert in pale light, Jack finally spoke again. "Pull over here." We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but sand and scrub brush. My heart pounded as I brought the car to a stop. Was this where it would end? "Get out," Jack ordered, gesturing with the knife. On shaky legs, I stepped out of the car. Jack followed, keeping the weapon trained on me. "Start walking," he said, nodding towards the expanse of desert. "You're just going to leave me out here?" I asked, disbelief and fear warring in my voice. Jack's eyes were cold. "You should have minded your own business. Now walk." I took a few steps, my mind whirling. I couldn't just let him take my car and leave me stranded in the desert. I'd die out here. In that moment, fueled by desperation and adrenaline, I made a decision. I spun around and lunged at Jack, catching him off guard. We grappled, the knife between us, each fighting for control. I felt a sharp pain in my side but ignored it, focusing all my energy on wrenching the knife away. Finally, with a burst of strength I didn't know I possessed, I managed to disarm him. The knife fell to the ground and I kicked it away. Jack stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock and fury. But without his weapon, the balance had shifted. I saw fear replace the anger in his eyes. "It's over," I panted, my side throbbing where the knife had grazed me. "We're going to the police now." But Jack had other ideas. With a final desperate look, he turned and ran into the desert. I watched him go, too exhausted and in too much pain to give chase. I collapsed against the car, the adrenaline fading and the full impact of what had happened hitting me. I was alive, but I was injured and still miles from anywhere. With trembling hands, I checked my phone. No signal, of course. I was on my own. I got back in the car, wincing at the pain in my side. It wasn't too deep, but it was bleeding steadily. I found an old t-shirt in my bag and pressed it against the wound. As I started the engine, I looked out at the vast desert. Somewhere out there, Jack was running, though I couldn't imagine he'd get far in this unforgiving landscape. Part of me felt guilty for leaving him, but self-preservation won out. I needed to get help for myself and to alert the authorities about Jack. I drove for what felt like hours. The pain in my side, a constant reminder of how close I'd come to a much worse fate. Finally, blessedly, I saw signs of civilization. A small town shimmering in the distance like a mirage. I pulled into the first gas station. I saw relief washing over me as I spotted a payphone. Within minutes, the police and an ambulance were on their way. As I sat in the back of the ambulance being treated for my wound, I gave my statement to the police. They assured me they would search for Jack. Though given the vastness of the desert, I wasn't optimistic about their chances of finding him. In the days that followed, as I recovered in a local hospital, I learned more about Jack. He was wanted in 3 states for a string of violent crimes. I had unwittingly picked up a dangerous fugitive. The police praised me for my bravery, but I didn't feel brave. I felt foolish for having put myself in that situation in the first place. The road trip I had dreamed about for so long had turned into a nightmare I couldn't wait to wake up from. As I was discharged from the hospital, the doctor gave me a stern look. "You're lucky," he said. "A few inches deeper and that knife would have hit something vital. Be more careful who you let into your car next time," I told myself, knowing I had learned that lesson the hard way. My cross-country adventure was over. All I wanted now was to go home, sleep in my own bed, and try to erase the terror of those hours in the desert with Jack. But as I boarded the plane heading back east, I realized forgetting wouldn't be so simple. The scars, both physical and emotional, would be a constant reminder of that night. The vast emptiness of the American West, which once felt so full of promise, now seemed foreboding and dangerous. The kindness I had always prided myself on had nearly cost me my life. Yet, as the plane lifted off, I found myself gazing out at the patchwork of landscapes below, a swirl of emotions stirring inside me. Fear, undoubtedly, but also a newfound respect for the unpredictability of life and the strength I never knew I had. I had set out on this trip seeking adventure and self-discovery. I found both, though not in the way I had imagined. The road had tested me, pushed me beyond my limits, and shown me what I was capable of when I was forced to fight for my survival. As we soared above the very highways I had once traveled, I made a quiet vow to myself. This experience wouldn't break me. I would learn from it, grow stronger because of it. And someday, when the nightmares faded and the scars had healed, I would return to the open road. But next time, if I saw a hitchhiker, I would keep on driving.